Well, why don't we do that? We may have some other folks join us online, but it might be actually nice to begin after the roll call to Adam, ask your new staff to introduce themselves, given that they're going to be playing such a strong role in this arena going forward.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. All right.
Just a reminder to everyone in the room that the microphone is in the middle. So you kind of have to speak loudly so that those on the line can hear.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to this meeting of the AB 1757 Expert Advisory Committee on Natural and Working Lands. It's wonderful today that we have two outstanding guest speakers in Lydia Vaughn and Jim Holmquist to talk about coastal wetlands, and in particular on modeling and forecasting improvements to assess the potential and actuality of both CO2 sequestration and other climate benefits from coastal wetlands. But we also today have the pleasure of seeing a number of the new staff that have joined Cal EPA's program, now headed by our very own Adam Moreno. And so right after the roll call, if we could ask them to introduce themselves, that would be wonderful. So in today's meeting, one thing I do want to flag is that I will chair the first portion of the meeting. And then, given some family circumstances, I'm not in California, I'm on the East Coast, and I will need to depart after the discussion on coastal wetlands. And thankfully, Carrie Steenworth will take over and chair the meeting for the second portion thereof. So with that, why don't we begin with the roll call? And Christy.
Present.
John Calloway.
I'm here.
Nathaniel. Matt. William.
Here.
Laura Kuipers. Connor. Debbie, I see you there. Thought I saw you there. Is Debbie Rao present? Okay. Mark Schwartz. Mark indicated it might be difficult for him to be here. He has a family emergency as well. Carrie is there. And Melissa?
Here.
Excellent. I can see you online. Lori is present, and Marian, I know, is unable to attend today. So with that, why don't we ask Adam for you to have your staff introduce themselves?
Yeah, all right. So we've got some people on board to the new section that's going to be helping track all of this action that we're going to try to make happen, and then also model it into the future and quantify the carbon impacts of all this stuff. So let's just start over here. Go ahead, Lee.
Hi, Lee Ternay. I came to CARB about 1.5 years ago after about 20 years split between the Park Service and Forest Service, various and sundry aspects of fire and smoke management and the forest ecology that underpins that. And then, so here I'm helping Adam's team with some of those issues and some of the modeling that circles around those fire management and issues like that. Were you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Hey everyone, my name is Alex Yu. I've been in CARB for about 9 years now. Spent most of my time on the Forest Offset Compliance Program, and now I'm working on the SB 27 registry, and I'll also be working with Adam's group on various 1757 things.
I'm Tara Seeley.
prior to joining CARB, I was working on my PhD at UC Berkeley studying the structure and function of forested ecosystems. And I joined the nature-based strategies section, Adam's team, about a month ago. I'll be helping with the natural and working lands inventory, leading the cropland and developed land portion of it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kelsey Brewer. Most recently, before joining CARB about a month ago, I was the district scientist for the Marin Resource Conservation District. My background is as an agroecologist, and before Marin Resource Conservation District, I received my PhD in soil science at UC Davis. My role for the new nature-based strategies section is predominantly tracking, quantifying, and kind of working on some architecture around biomass for the natural and working lands inventory.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kyle Lindenberg. I've met some of the committee members before, for those I haven't. Hello. Within Adam's team here, I'll be working on ecosystem level carbon stock exchange broadly. More specifically, current efforts with the National Working Lands Inventory. I'll be leading the wetlands effort along with a couple other areas. Prior to this, I was postdocing with San Diego State University, but spent most of my time in the Arctic tundra studying tundra greenhouse gas exchange dynamics. So happy to be here, getting the jump.
And we have Ryan online too. Ryan.
Oh, I think I'm unmuted. Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Bart. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, just wanted to double check. I'm Ryan Bart. I am a week into working at CARB. Previously, I was at UC Merced, where I was a research scientist for many years, doing various things primarily. And I'm a ecohydrologist and do a lot of modeling at the interface between water, vegetation, and fire.
And then Matthias.
Yeah, hello, my name is Matthias Falk. I've been with CARB for almost 10 years working on remote sensing and anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. I will be joining Adam's team on Monday, so I'm not quite there yet, but soon will join them. Before coming to CARB, I worked on climate change impacts on the carbon cycle of old growth forests on the Pacific Northwest. I since then have had a combined experience in remote sensing and regional scale climate models, coupled vegetation models to assess the impact of climate change and regional climate on Mediterranean ecosystems. And I'm really excited to be lending my expertise to the excellent team that Adam has assembled here. Thank you.
Thanks. And then of course we have Chelsea, but you already know Chelsea, so she doesn't need to introduce it. Well, I don't know. You can talk about what you're working on.
Yeah, good to see everyone. I am going in when I'm in my second month at the Air Resources Board now, and I split my time in Adam's section and another section at the Air Resources Board working on the SB 27 carbon registry, working on the carbon inventory, specifically leading the grasslands update and some updates to the soils carbon inventory, as well as working on AB 1757 stuff, like helping to lead this expert advisory committee from the Air Resources Board side.
Yeah, thanks. And then we'll have a few more people joining in as well in the coming months. So yeah, that's it.
Well, shortly you will outnumber us all. So we expect great things from you. Yeah. Well, thank you. I think with this, we should turn over to our guest presenters. And as I mentioned, we're really, really pleased to have both Lydia Vaughn from CEPI and Jim Holmquist from the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. And actually, I would like to turn to Melissa and John to introduce the two of them. And Lydia will be going first. So Melissa, will you be doing that introduction?
Yes, I will be introducing the speakers, and I also have maybe 5 or 10 minutes of my own sort of intro based on some ongoing work that I've been doing that I thought I might open with.
Excellent.
If that
over
works.
to you.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay in the room? I'm hoping.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. I do not have slides, but I think maybe that's all right since we'll be looking at a lot of slides today. So I just wanted to kick off with introduction for the speakers, but also framing some of this in the bigger picture with some of the ongoing work that I've been doing with Adam and CARB staff and the Ocean Protection Council staff and some of the broader blue carbon wetland community over the last like couple years or something. So, you know, it's long been a desire to include coastal habitats into state climate goals. That's not new, but since the last scoping plan came out, that last plans had included more of the delta in terms of its scenarios and goals for carbon reduction. And since then, there are more data available, there are more models available, and we're sort of looking towards including wetlands beyond the delta into next iterations of state climate goals and state scoping plans. And so, you know, trying to figure out where we're at. But despite some, you know, despite the fact that we may have more data available now than we used to, that doesn't necessarily mean we have the full picture, because in order to include these habitats, they have to meet specific needs for state models. And so and that's true of any, it's not just true for blue carbon habitats, it's true of any land type that you would include, that the type of data must meet the needs of the modeling. And so this has been some of the effort that I have been going through with Sri Gopal at OPC and Adam and myself to try to match those things up. So there's a bunch of scientific data, GIS data, carbon data, carbon sequestration, carbon stock data, flux data. And then on the other side, you can envision all the criteria that would be needed in order to include any land type into these models. And so trying to stitch those two things to look at what we have data and model wise and what we need and where we are falling short. And this exercise has been helpful for coastal zones, but you can imagine it being helpful for other land types. And so Jim, for example, is going to talk about one of those models that is a good candidate for broader application across the state. And Lydia has also been working with a lot of these data that could go into those kinds of things. And so we can sort of look forward to their discussions on that. And the other thing I wanted to highlight a little bit was that we're discussing inclusion of the coasts more broadly, or blue carbon habitats. And that means tidal marshes, salt marshes, but it also means seagrass meadows, seaweeds, and other soft bottom sediments. And so Lydia and Jim are going to talk mostly about tidal wetlands and salt marshes today, but that doesn't mean that the other habitats ought to be overlooked. There's not quite as much data available, but those other habitats each have their own sets of unique considerations that are quite different from one another and different to other land types that might be included. So, you know, largely the carbon value in these habitats is in the sediment, not in the overlying biomass. And in some cases, the biomass serves to retain the carbon in sediment. So you think about a seagrass meadow, the blades of seagrass are not holding that much carbon themselves, but they can lead to high sediment retention. But that also means when lost, you can see high loss of carbon laterally. And so that's also true in soft bottom sediments, or in the case of kelp forests, most of the carbon you would see sequestered would occur like outside the box you might draw around your habitat type. So like exported offshore below the mixed layer in the ocean. And so that provides some unique challenges to model these things where they have lateral transport. Salt marshes have some of these same considerations, but they're a little bit easier to monitor and model. I mean, for a subtidal seagrass meadow, you can't use remote sensing in most cases because the water we have in California is too turbid. And so that's a real challenge, is just monitoring data availability. And so due to many of these considerations, we're more advanced in our tidal wetlands than we are in kelp forests and seagrass meadows. And I'm happy to talk more about that on the back end, but that is sort of why you'll hear largely from Lydia and Jim about salt marshes and tidal wetlands. So I think I will mostly leave it at that, although I'm sort of hoping that if we have discussion on the back end, I'd be happy to talk more about the work with CARB and OPC and how it pertains to the information that Jim and Lydia will present. I guess also flagging that there was a report generated from that work that will come out in the coming months that hopefully it's focused on tidal wetlands, but there's some information in there that can be more broadly applied to other land types. So, you know, what are the things that a habitat or that a model must include? Things like, is it open source? Like, does it include emissions? Has the uncertainty been quantified? Are we okay with that level of uncertainty? Are there multiple models? How ready to go are they? And all of those types of criteria. And so we can look towards, you know, evaluating where we're at on each of those criteria, and some of those criteria are also outlined in the report that will come out. So yeah, I think with that, John, did you have anything you wanted to add before we turn it over to Lydia and Jim?
No, I don't. I'm all set.
Great. Then I will kick it off to Lydia, who's with SFEI.
Great, thanks for the intro, Melissa. And I think I have slides. I think I was going to just ask them to be advanced, and they were part of that master deck. Is that the case?
Yes, I'm working on pulling them.
We're getting there.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I really appreciate the invitation to join today's conversation, and it's also really exciting to hear how big the group at CARB has grown. Wish I were there in person. Sorry to be joining remotely, but hope that this can be a fruitful conversation. So I'm going to get us started today with kind of a high-level overview of some of the key modeling and key management considerations that we should be thinking about as we think about our models. And then I do think Jim is going to kind of take a little bit of a deeper dive into one particular model and some of the data sets. So hopefully we'll offer kind of a nice segue from the large scale kind of broad considerations down into the finer scale data. Next slide, please. And so in this presentation, I'm first going to talk through some of the key marsh processes that we need to consider, then provide a quick overview of some management strategies that we should be thinking about as we think about sort of what implementation looks like and what we might need to try to capture with our models. Then I'll offer a quick intro to some existing models and the necessary data to support those models, and then highlight some of the existing wetland monitoring and tracking programs that are going on around the state that would be possible for CARB staff to leverage as they think about tracking wetlands. Next slide, please. So yeah, as I said, I wanted to start out by getting us all on the same page for today's discussion about sort of what the key coastal wetland processes are that control carbon stocks, carbon sequestration rates, and greenhouse gas emissions. This may be review for many people in the room, maybe it's review for everyone, but just want to recognize that there are really some fundamental differences between how coastal wetlands work compared with upland soils. And as Melissa noted, here we're really focused on what's stored below ground, since that's the vast majority of carbon stocks in our coastal wetlands. And these real differences between coastal wetlands and upland soils also has a strong influence on kind of the type and structure of the data and the models that we need. Next slide. So when we look across a marsh profile from the shoreline all the way up to the landward edge, we need to consider kind of a number of different processes. We need to think about erosion and marsh expansion, which is also known as progradation at the wetland edge. We need to be thinking about vertical accretion and subsidence. And we also need to be thinking about marsh migration and coastal squeeze. And those three kind of aggregate sets of processes together are the fundamental control on carbon stocks and sequestration rates in these wetlands. And then, of course, we also need to consider other greenhouse gas fluxes, particularly methane and nitrous oxide. And another sort of important point that I think we're all keeping in mind is that with all of these processes, we're thinking not only about current rates, but also about how they're likely to respond to climate change. And in our coastal wetlands, kind of the number one climate change impact that we should be considering is sea level rise. Next slide, please. So the first process I'll briefly cover is accretion and subsidence. And this is the accumulation, loss, or compaction of mineral and organic sediment on the marsh surface. And so really this is the fundamental primary process through which marshes accumulate carbon through both vegetation inputs and also sedimentation on the marsh surface of suspended sediment from the water column. Next slide. And then as we look forward, one of the most pressing questions that we should be thinking about in our coastal wetlands is how sea level rise will affect accretion rates, and also particularly the persistence of our vegetated marshes. So a number of modeling studies have explored this question, and generally, if we look out to 2100 and beyond, unfortunately, the outlook isn't necessarily great. So this figure that you see here is from a 2018 paper by Karen Thorne and her co-authors that used a marsh accretion model called WARMR to assess both vegetation transitions and also elevation changes associated with future sea level rise across Pacific Coast marshes. And the bottom half of each of these figures shows California sites. And what you can see here is that with both moderate sea level rise on the left and also high rates of simulated sea level rise, this study projected fairly widespread conversion of vegetated marshes to mudflats or subtidal elevations. So as we look toward the future, we need to be thinking about how marsh accretion rates may or may not keep pace with sea level rise. Next slide.
Lydia, I'm going to pause you for 1 second. We're having some technical issues here in the room that I need to just fix quickly. I'm sorry. It's not showing up on the main screen and I need to exit
Oh,
out
sounds
of
great.
it.
Take your time.
Sorry, y'all. One job I got. Sure, well,
This is complicated. There's a lot of screen.
I'm not sure what that I need to exit out of.
Leslie, let me know if you want me to reach out to James.
Thank you. He was just in here.
Of course. Okay.
Oh, it's all right.
Can we, is this okay? Can we?
I mean, I can't really. I have it pulled up here so I can read it, but.
Because like you said, I had to exit out and stop sharing.
Sure.
There we go.
Now.
One.
Yes.
All right, there we go. Okay, I'm gonna go to full screen. All right, okay, thank you. We're good. All right, and I will, yes, admit. Go to
All
the
right,
next slide.
so
Thank you.
everyone can see?
Yes.
Great.
Very nice.
In practice, when we think not just about modeling, but actually quantifying vertical accretion and carbon accumulation, in our coastal wetlands, we need to remember that unlike upland systems where carbon inputs become integrated throughout the soil profile through root inputs and downward transport of surface materials, these coastal wetlands accrete vertically. So they accumulate sediment layer upon layer upon the surface, a little bit like layers on a cake. So what this means is that sediment cores can be used to assess long-term vertical accretion and carbon sequestration rates. So if you take a long sediment core, you can section that core date the individual sections and use those dates to evaluate rates over sort of tens, hundreds, and beyond of years of carbon accumulation rates in those sediments. For short-term rates, there are other methods that can be used to track sediment accumulation and carbon accumulation on the surface. So one that's commonly used is known as surface elevation tables, or SETs. And those are able to measure small-scale changes in marsh surface elevations due to both sediment accretion and also ongoing subsidence. And so these can be combined with what are called marker horizons, when you lay down a layer of feldspar clay that's visible later when you come back and take a core, to assess both short-term elevation changes and also short-term carbon accumulation rates. Now, these short-term and long-term carbon accumulation rate measurements that I just measured are both point measurements. So if we want to think about landscape scale measurements, one option is using LiDAR that's been corrected for vegetation to assess changes over time in marsh elevations due to accretion or subsidence. And so all of these methods, those three methods, can be used to assess carbon accumulation rates. But I also want to note that flux towers are commonly implemented in coastal wetland sites and can also be used to assess CO2 exchange. But because there is tidal exchange of carbon, as Melissa was referring to, these CO2 fluxes can only be used to quantify carbon sequestration in the case where that lateral transport is also quantified. Next slide, please. So moving on to the next process I want to describe, marsh migration is the upslope movement of the marsh's landward edge as sea level rises. And when migration isn't possible, either due to topographic barriers or due to development, this is commonly referred to as coastal squeeze. Next slide, please. So this map is from Sassoon Marsh in the San Francisco estuary. And the Baylands Resilience Framework has mapped migration space around the estuary, which is shown here in yellow. And they've also assessed how well connected a given marsh patch is to this migration space, and that's shown in the gradient of orange. So this figure, what you can see is that, first of all, migration opportunities are often limited by development. There are real barriers to connectivity. Many of these marsh patches, based on their location and also their proximity to development, don't have high percentage connectivity to migration space. And also, migration space is often limited by topography. You can see there's kind of a patch in the center of the marsh, that's the Potrero Hills. And even in areas that have high connectivity to migration space, there may just not be a large area of migration opportunity available. And both of these are particularly the case in areas that are highly urbanized or where we have fringing marshes that exist on the seaward side of levees. Next slide, please. And then one other important set of marsh processes I want to briefly discuss is erosion and progradation. And these are the loss or expansion of marsh or mudflat at the shoreward edge due to either wave erosion or sedimentation in the case of progradation. Next slide. And I wanted to show this example to show kind of how striking this challenge has the potential to be looking toward the future. So this is an example from San Francisco Bay, from Corte Madera Marsh, which is a site that's been rapidly eroding over the past several years. So in these images from 2018 and 2019, the red areas in the image on the right are places where more than 0.6 of a meter of sediment has been lost in just that 1 year, from 2018 to 2019. And if you were to look at a longer time series of imagery from Google Earth, you could see just that entire marsh edge eroding backward toward the landward direction. So when we think about this from the perspective of carbon, it's really important. And I guess to add some numbers to that perspective, 0.6 of a meter of sediment lost in just this 1 year period of time represents roughly 150 years of carbon accumulation. So if marsh losses due to erosion increase as sea level rise increases, which we do anticipate, particularly in many areas that are more erosive, this has the potential to have a really large impact on wetland carbon budgets. Next slide, please. And then finally, just the last process I want to briefly mention is that in addition to thinking about carbon stocks and carbon sequestration, we of course need to consider emissions of other greenhouse gases, particularly methane and nitrous oxide. And for these, we'll need to be thinking both about current rates and also how their emission rates are expected to change with climate and with management related impacts. Next slide. Now, with that overview of the sort of key processes we need to be thinking about, I wanted to briefly touch on a few management strategies that are being used or are under development to maintain function in our coastal wetlands. And this is just thinking beyond just restoration. What can we do to actually think about conservation, not just in terms of placing legal protection, but actually helping keep our wetlands where they currently are. Next slide. So as I noted earlier, marsh migration is going to be an important process in the future as we think about sustaining our coastal wetlands. The map that's shown here shows migration space opportunity in the northern portion of the San Francisco estuary. And what I want to point out is that only the areas that are shown in yellow are currently under legal protection. So everything that's shown in orange is part of this potential migration space, but does not have any legal protection. So in order to maximize our opportunities into the future for marsh migration, which is going to be one sort of critical strategy for maintaining our marshes and our carbon sequestration rates, a critical management strategy is going to be to place more of this potential migration space under legal protection from development. Next slide. And a second management strategy in both our existing and also our restored wetlands is known as strategic sediment placement. And this refers to applying sediment on the marsh surface in order to build elevations and help those marshes keep pace with sea level rise. And there are three main ways in which strategic sediment placement is currently being considered or piloted or used. One of those is known as marsh spraying. This is often also referred to as thin layer placement. And with this strategy, sediment that's been dredged for navigation or for flood control is sprayed onto the marsh surface in order to increase accretion rates. A second strategy is known as water column seeding. And in this strategy, sediment is added to the water column during an incoming tide in order to increase suspended sediment concentrations above the marsh. And then the third is known as shallow water placement. And here sediment is placed offshore with the idea that it will then be resuspended by wave action and by the tides and transported up onto the marshes. Next slide. And all of those sediment placement options do have important considerations for local ecosystem function. They can bury vegetation, bury benthic organisms. So there's a number of projects going on or kind of under consideration to test how these strategies can be carried out in a way that both effectively increases accretion rates and also has minimum ecological impacts. And an example shown here is the Eden Landing Shallow Water Placement Pilot Project. This is being led by the Army Corps, and they're placing sediment in shallow water near the Eden Landing restoration in San Francisco Bay. Next slide. Then another family of management strategies is shoreline stabilization or protection of the wetland edge to prevent that marsh and mudflat erosion that has the potential to really impact existing carbon stocks. So where we have soft shorelines, so natural features like marshes, mudflats, or beaches that haven't already been built up with great infrastructure, our best bet is to look to nature-based strategies that can intercept wave energy and sort of reduce erosion at that shoreline edge. These include construction of nearshore artificial reefs, oyster reefs, for instance, mudflat augmentation, which is similar to what I just described on the marshes where sediment is sprayed onto mudflats, beach nourishment or beach creation. So historically was more common for tidal marshes to be protected by fringing or offshore beaches. And many of those have been lost. So reestablishing beaches to help protect our tidal wetlands is another strategy. And then also planting submerged aquatic vegetation or seagrass not only has sort of direct benefits for carbon sequestration, but also is another strategy for limiting erosion for nearby marshes. Next slide, please. And then the last one I want to mention of these management approaches is to note that many of our baylands have been disconnected from natural sediment inputs, as historically creeks were straightened, creeks were levied, and the sediment coming out of the watersheds was sent offshore instead of onto the marshes. So reestablishing these connections can really help increase the inputs of natural sediment sources onto marshes and mudflats and help increase accretion rates. Next slide. So with that introduction or that background on kind of what I think we should be considering with respect to marsh processes and management approaches, I just want to offer a quick overview of models and data that we can use to develop a cohesive and comprehensive statewide model for the state. So I'll quickly touch on some available models, data needs associated with those models and with tracking wetlands, and also frontiers or sort of some of the gaps that a focus on those gaps may really help move us forward. Next slide, please. So there are several models available to evaluate some of the processes that I mentioned around the state and tidal wetlands. And here I'm also including the Delta. I'm not sure what the scope is of the work that the CARB group and CNRA will be doing here, but given that the Delta was historically a tidal wetland and there are opportunities for tidal wetland restoration and peat building wetlands, including it here, just so we have that information as well. Next slide. To model vertical accretion in tidal wetlands, two models that I want to mention that I believe, at least in part, Jim will be getting into some more details about shortly, are the marsh equilibrium model or coastal wetland equilibrium model. Those are two versions of the same model, often known as MEM or SWIM, and also the wetland accretion rate model of ecosystem resilience, which is known as WARMR. And then in the Delta, in peat building wetlands, the SED-Calc model was developed by HydroFocus and has been extensively applied and tested in the Delta. Next slide. For subsidence, in Delta drained agricultural lands, the SubCalc model was also developed by HydroFocus and applied widely. Next slide, please. For edge erosion, I am not aware of any models or application of the above models to look at edge erosion in tidal wetlands. So this is, I think, a really important consideration for how this can be tackled, given our existing information. Next slide. And similarly, a number of studies have looked at migration space opportunities, but I don't know of any fully process-based models that have integrated marsh migration. Next slide. And to look at CO2 exchange, net CO2 flux can be evaluated from the change in carbon stocks that are predicted by these accretion and subsidence models. Also, the peppermint model, which was originally developed to look at greenhouse gas exchanges in the delta in peat building wetlands has also been adapted for tidal wetlands as well. And this model can be used to look at kind of more fine scale CO2 exchanges. Next slide. In addition to CO2, Peppermint also predicts methane, both in delta peat building wetlands and also sort of in its new form across the salinity gradient in tidal wetlands. Next slide. And then I believe the DNDC model has been applied in drained agricultural peatlands in the delta, but I'm not aware of any models that have tackled nitrous oxide fluxes in California's coastal wetlands. And just want to note that this is a modeling gap as far as I know, but also more broadly a knowledge gap. There just really are fewer data on nitrous oxide from tidal wetlands, and the data that have been collected do show that these fluxes are highly variable and pretty challenging to predict. Next slide, please. So in order to apply these models and to track change over time in coastal wetland properties, there are several key data sets that are needed, and many of these data sets are available. These are not all gaps. Just want to note the things that we should make sure are kind of top of mind when we think about the data that we need to apply these models. So to parameterize the vertical accretion models, some key parameter data sets include tidal datums, so both present day tidal datums and also projected tidal datums with sea level rise. These include marsh elevations, particularly relative to those tidal datums. That relative marsh elevation is often referred to as Z star and is one of the greatest sensitivities in these vertical accretion models. These models rely on information on vegetation, including vegetation community, vegetation biomass, and root to shoot ratios. Another important parameter when we think about methane in particular is salinity. And then also suspended sediment concentrations are one other key parameter that factor into these models. And then to track change over time, some key data sets that will be important. Again, these are not all gaps. Many of these are things that we have fairly extensive measurements of, and I know Jim has been working a lot in this space and maybe going to speak to this shortly. But these include accurate mapping of marshes and mudflats and how those change over time, sediment cores, LIDAR that's been corrected for marsh vegetation, those surface elevation tables and marker horizon data to look at short-term carbon accumulation rates, methane fluxes, and then also CO2 fluxes paired with lateral transport measurements to better enable the use of flux measurements to look at carbon accumulation. Next slide, please. And then when we want to think about how to get from where we are with the models to a cohesive statewide model that captures all the elements of coastal wetland carbon dynamics that are important to consider, just want to highlight several model frontiers where we can build on our existing models to capture this statewide. And I know I'm particularly focused on building on our existing models because a large amount of work has already been done to develop these models. And I think rather than start fresh and try to think of an entire new framework, we should use the models that we already have and think about how to integrate them in a way that captures the full suite of processes that are needed. So these kind of next modeling frontiers that I see rising to the top are first integrating multiple models into a cohesive model. I know Jim's been working on this in the case of MEM and Peppermint, so I suspect you'll be hearing a little bit about that soon. Second, it's going to be important to represent dynamic vegetation when we aim to model responses of our tidal wetlands to sea level rise and also to changing salinity, both in ways that can either increase or decrease the resilience of our wetlands. This has been done in the case of the warmer model in at least one application, but I am not aware of it having been integrated into MEM or really sort of broadly integrated into the structure of these models. And then third, these models are all one-dimensional. So they do need to be scaled across the state for the state's needs. And this could look like building a fully three-dimensional model, which would be very costly and also frankly challenging to produce sort of meaningful advances given the state of the science. Alternatively, the models could be run with gridded parameters in a way that accounts for vegetation transitions. Or alternatively, there's been work done with the Lucas model, which is essentially a framework that ingests other models to be able to integrate these models into a spatially explicit framework that captures land cover transitions. And then finally, none of the existing models have been adapted to represent marsh migration, erosion and progradation, or management actions, at least not that I'm aware of. So finding ways to incorporate these processes, at least in a somewhat simplified way, will make it possible to look not just at the outcomes of sort of what's happening with our wetlands, but more explicitly at management pathways. So really how we can get from where we are to the targets that have been set for coastal wetlands. Next slide. And then even looking beyond those modeling frontiers, just wanted to note that there are some important science frontiers where ongoing research targeting some knowledge gaps will be important for informing our conceptual models and also our ability to simulate coastal wetland processes. So ones that jump out to me are, first of all, ongoing research to understand the range of management opportunities and management impacts, including sediment management, beach creation, artificial reefs, and seagrass to limit erosion. Another key gap is lateral transport. And then sort of associated with that gap is also the fate of eroded carbon. So when we do lose sediment on our wetland edge, whether that carbon is oxidized or reburied elsewhere is really important when we think from the carbon perspective. And then, as I said before, nitrous oxide is really a knowledge gap that could be an important part of the picture. So here, sort of big questions exist around not only understanding flux rates, but also the degree to which those flux rates are driven by wetland processes versus upland processes. And those are going to be important for understanding kind of the specific wetland contribution to the greenhouse gas budgets. Next slide. And so the last topic that I'm just briefly going to touch on today is some programs and projects that do exist around the state that are working on monitoring and tracking our wetland extents, our wetland properties, and also restoration or enhancement projects in coastal wetlands. Next slide. So probably the most fundamental information that's needed to track change over time in our wetlands is looking at how those wetland extents are changing as management changes and as sea level rise changes. And currently, the CCAP data have been used in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory and also could be used in California, but there is no California-specific map that does this change over time mapping at high resolution. That said, there are several recent regional scale automated mapping efforts that have been specifically designed to make it possible to track fine scale changes over time in the extents and the types of California's wetlands and mudflats. So these are the San Diego automated mapping, San Francisco Bay, Baylands habitat map, which just came out within the last month or two, and also the Russian River automated mapping, which is sort of currently under development. So each of these maps, each one is regional. We don't have a statewide map that currently knits these together, but there is a set of white papers that the Ocean Protection Council will be releasing, I believe, early next year, that will describe options for statewide mapping for the purpose of change detection that likely will take into account what's happening with these automated mapping efforts. Next slide. And then in addition to wetland extents, monitoring is also needed to track changes in wetland processes, changes in model parameters, and changes in carbon stocks. So in this case, I just want to note that CARB and CNRA does not need to start from scratch. There are a number of regional monitoring programs that exist around the state, some of which are sort of just about to get up and running. So there'll be a large amount of data coming online, at least in regions of the state, over the coming couple years. To name a few of these programs that are collecting kind of the most applicable data for what we're discussing today, the San Francisco Estuary Wetlands Regional Monitoring Program, or WRMP, is one of them. The Southern California Wetlands Recovery Project is another regional monitoring program that's just getting up and running. The Russian River Regional Monitoring Program is currently under development and being designed. And also the San Francisco Bay Regional Monitoring Program Sediment Work Group is collecting sediment information that could be important for parameterizing our models. So all of these programs, I want to note, have been designed using what's called the RAMP framework, which is sort of California's best practices for management-oriented monitoring. This framework builds on the EPA's Level 1, 2, 3 framework for monitoring and assessment. So these are programs that are aligned in their overall monitoring approach, and it's really sort of a rigorous and kind of well agreed upon approach to monitoring for the sake of management decisions. And then I also want to note that this, it may be valuable for staff from CARB or CNRA to reach out directly to individual monitoring programs, and also to participate in the California Wetland Monitoring Work Group, which is kind of a place to both share sort of requests and ideas about the types of monitoring data that are needed for your effort, and also to keep up to speed on what's going on around the state with these regional monitoring programs. Next slide. So just to highlight an example, the San Francisco Estuary Regional Monitoring Program, or WRMP, as I said, it's now just getting off the ground. And this program has a monitoring site network that includes benchmark sites that represent ancient marshes, includes reference sites that represent sort of late stage restoration projects at their target conditions, and also project sites reflecting a variety of design and management approaches that are sort of more recently implemented. The WRMP is monitoring a lot of things, far more than I'm showing on this slide. And some of those are particularly relevant to the questions that this group is considering. Those include shoreline change, so erosion progradation. They include wetland elevations, vegetation communities, tidal inundation, salinity, sediment supply, and wetland condition. Next slide. And then finally, one other piece of information that I know is needed is standardized statewide tracking of wetland restoration, conservation, enhancement, and mitigation projects. And for this, there is a platform that exists called EcoAtlas Project Tracker, which has compiled and continues to compile a lot of this information across the state. So Project Tracker is a database and data entry tool for compiling project information such as project type, project acreage, date of implementation and completion, and spatial footprint that's entered as polygons. 3 of the state's water boards do require project permittees to input project information into Project Tracker. And also other regional organizations like the Central Coast Wetlands Group and the Southern California Wetlands Recovery Project have been engaged with Project Tracker and input information. So generally speaking, the information along the coast in Project Tracker is pretty complete, pretty good. And also in other areas that have regulatory requirements to input information. Just want to note that all of these tools, so the mapping data, the project information, are available on the EcoAtlas platform, which is really its intention and sole purpose is to curate this information and make it publicly available. So next slide, please. So just want to conclude with a few thoughts. First of all, our measurements and models should be tailored to the unique processes and the unique stressors that govern our coastal wetlands. Second, a statewide effort can leverage and expand upon existing models, data sets, and programs. There's a lot that's already been done, and that really sets us up to build upon what's already happened around the state and what's ongoing. Third, increasing carbon sequestration and avoiding carbon losses is going to require some innovative management that goes all the way from the shoreline to the uplands. This really needs to be an all hands on deck approach. And I think we're likely to see both some really important innovations in coordination over the coming years and also some major challenges for our wetlands, particularly when we look later in the century. And then last, I just wanted to know, this is sort of a kind of a parallel comment, that our targets are really only as good as our implementation. And I know that this is a group of scientists, and we're here talking about modeling and talking about data sets, but fundamentally we're here not just to figure out how to model wetlands, but we also really want to see the state meet its climate targets and meet its ecosystem goals. So in order to spur implementation at the pace that's needed, it's going to be a big challenge, and it's going to require ambitious coordination between the state and the local scale at which implementation happens, and also support for regional programs that can really help move these projects forward from the visioning stage through design and permitting all the way to the point at which there are shovels going into the ground, and then following that through adaptive management. So today I'm excited to talk about the science and the modeling needs, but I also just wanted to sort of make that note because I think it's important for us to keep in mind the modeling and the quantification is just one small piece of a larger picture as the state develops what a roadmap looks like toward actually meeting the targets. So with that, I really appreciate everyone listening, excited to have a conversation, and happy to pass it on to Jim. And I had a couple extra slides at the end. You can just skip past them.
Before we ask you to begin, Jim, can we just also take note that we were joined by several other members of the committee from the beginning. And so I just want to flag that Matt Holmes joined, Laura Cooper's joined, and I believe that Nathaniel joined as well. So thank you all for joining in, and that was a great presentation. We're going to take questions for both at the end. So Jim, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, my name's Jim Holmquist. I'm a research scientist at Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. And today my talk is titled Forecasting Blue Carbon Dynamics, Data and Models for California Coastal Monitoring and Decision Support. So I'm based out of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. I kind of jokingly refer to myself, though, as the only member of CERC Southwest. I live in California, in Long Beach, and I work out of my house. So my main gig, though, is that I'm the director of the Coastal Carbon Network, which is a program hosted at Smithsonian, but really is a real grassroots effort linking academic scientists, government scientists, and practitioners from all around the world, kind of unified with the goal of getting wisdom and insight out of all of our collective data sets and models. So, next slide, please. I just wanted to upfront acknowledge that I did not do a lot of this work alone, and a lot of the work was done by our hardworking staff and the alumni of my lab, and two working groups, which a soils working group and a methane working group that Coastal Carbon Network hosted. We've been working on some of these data sets and models for about 5 years, and there's people who have put a lot of kind of volunteer hours into this. So thanks everyone involved. Next slide, please. So I'm gonna first talk a little bit about forecasting in general. So how and why do we forecast? So kind of the definition of a forecast, I think, is it represents a fusion of our observations and our process knowledge. And our process knowledge is represented by numerical and process models. Why do we forecast? Well, we have to make decisions whether we want to or not, and we should be using the best information that we have at the time to inform those decisions. Forecasting also improves the state of our knowledge. I know people like to make a lot of jokes about weather forecasters always getting it wrong, but if you look at the practice of weather forecasting since the 1950s when it started, weather forecasting has improved massively because of just the practice of making a lot of predictions, rapidly validating them with new data, iteratively improving the models and the data sets that we use to calibrate and check those models. Next slide, please. So thinking about kind of what to talk about in all of this and what to tackle as a state, I like to think of like what our goals are and what our constraints are. And I'm going to propose that some of the goals of this talk and maybe some of the goals of this working group are, first, we want to make the best predictions that we have with the data and models we already have. We don't want to be sitting around waiting for the next best thing to make a decision. We don't want to be sitting on our hands. We have to be doing our best with what we currently have. Two, we want to make predictions that are useful for management. Third, we need to be transparent and quantitative, importantly, with the level of confidence that we have in our predictions. Four, we want to make strategic improvements in our models and our data sets so that we can iteratively increase our confidence in our predictions. And finally, we want to leverage our existing research infrastructure. Next slide, please. So an outline for the rest of my talk, I'm going to go into into detail into some of the types of data that Lydia talked about. I'm going to talk about what the different types of data are used for, some of the pros and cons that are present in those data sets, and what I'm going to talk about what's available right now in California. And I'm going to talk a lot about scalability. So when I talk about scalability, usually I'm saying, what I'm saying is, how do we take the data that we have for monitored sites and apply it to unmonitored sites? No one's saying we're going to be out in every single wetland in California taking a hugely intensive, expensive, and invasive set of measurements. So the scalability question is important. I'm going to talk a lot in depth about some of the models that were mentioned for predicting marsh resilience to sea level rise and greenhouse gas fluxes. I'll talk a little bit about how they work, how we fit them across various sites, and I'll provide some information on how they perform. And then finally, I'll close with some thoughts about how I could see this all coming together for monitoring and decision support. Next slide, please. So the first thing I'll talk about is soil carbon stocks. As Lydia mentioned, scientists take a lot of cores. We go out with metal tubes or PVC tubes or half tubes. Everyone's got their own favorite tool of the trade, but essentially we punch a hole in the dirt, pull it up, slice it up, and then we measure. The most common measurements we have are the organic matter fraction of the soil and the dry bulk density of the soil. This involves a lot of weighing. You dry the dirt, weigh the dirt, burn the dirt, weigh it again, and a lot of undergraduate volunteer hours and grad student hours are spent this way. What is this data useful for? It's useful for carbon stock characterization, for estimating stock losses when you have a wetland that's been lost or you project will be lost. They're important for comparing control, restored and degrading sites, and they can be used to compare pre and post restoration sites. One of the pros of this type of data is that we have a lot of it. We have an extensive existing synthesis. I mentioned I'm the director of the Coastal Carbon Network. Kind of our flagship product is the Coastal Carbon Atlas. It's a global database of soil profile data from coastal wetlands. We have 15,000 soil profiles from 70 countries all around the world. Marshes, mangroves, seagrasses, swamps, tidal flats, no kelps. But yeah, it's pretty extensive. Some of the cons of this data, this large data synthesis, is that I don't really have any quantitative stuff to back this up, but this is just kind of my sense of things, is that sampling efforts are biased towards intact and healthy wetlands, and we don't have enough restoring wetlands, and especially we don't have enough comparative data showing before and after, or showing comparisons between interventions and controls. For California, we have 260 cores to do carbon stock assessments. A lot of this is from the San Francisco Bay Area, but that is also where we have most of our wetlands. But this data set I do not think is overly biased towards the Bay Area. We have a lot of data for Northern California, for Central California coast, and for Southern California as well. Next slide, please. So as Lydia mentioned, the way that we calculate carbon fluxes over longer term timescales, and this is where we're talking like 50 to 120 years, is different from what you would get in uplands. And our techniques borrow a lot more from paleoecology and paleoclimatology methods. We look at accretion, meaning for any given section of sediment, how many years it took to form that. And we do that using age depth modeling and a variety of dating techniques, including radiocarbon is the most kind of, people know what radiocarbon is. That's a little bit rarer in this field, and we typically use lead-210 modeling, which it's complicated to explain, but it dates about 100 to anywhere from like 80 to 120 years worth of accretion. We have radiocesium dating, which looks at the 1963 peak in above ground nuclear weapons testing and looks for the remains of that in the strata. And there are many other dated events that you can see in sediment, like introduced pollen showing up, like eucalyptus pollen in California. In the Chesapeake Bay, we see ragweed pollen increasing during European colonization. There's all these, every core has a story. It's very fun to work on this stuff and to hear all this history within the mud. The pros of this method, I think this is the best way we have to estimate baselines of long-term carbon accumulation rates. And these cores can be used to calibrate our models by generating hindcasts. That is, if we let our models run over a historical sea level rise scenario, match that up to the core, that's a way that we can fit our models and determine how they are how they're doing based on how well they can recreate the past. The cons of this type of data, it's expensive and it's time consuming to get. There's a lot of methodological choice involved. These techniques will not show rapid changes associated with management. Also, the quality of some of these techniques can vary regionally. That being said, we have 73 cores for California with these types of age depth models, which is very good, but they are mostly from the Bay Area. I do a lot of outreach with researchers, and I'm trying to get more data from coastal California into the atlas. And all I can say now is I'm working on it, and hopefully I can have news soon. Next slide, please. So for shorter term fluxes, Lydia mentioned that we have a couple different methods. One of them is eddy covariance towers. These read concentrations of greenhouse gases and water, and they use modeling of the eddies, the circular air movement, to calculate fluxes by modeling a footprint and seeing how much is going in and going out of that footprint. It's a little complicated, and it's not my area. It's not my main thing that I study. So I think that that's the level at which I can explain it. But Ameriflux, Neon, they do these kinds of measurements. They've got great videos on how it works. Ameriflux is kind of the big name in town when it comes to synthesizing and serving this data up. Some of the pros of this data are that it's continuous, it is detailed, it has a large footprint, and the interpretation of the data, I would say, while there is, everyone could have their own secret sauce here, it is potential to standardize it because Ameriflux has put out our libraries on how to do the data processing on the raw data. And of course, this data is available. It is public. You can download it. You can cite it. The con is that these are pretty expensive operations to run. And as Lydia mentioned, lateral flux can be an issue. If you're not measuring it, then you have a hole in your budget. We also have a different, so we have, as far as I know, 8 towers in California. 4 of them are in Elkhorn Slough, so we have a total of 4 sites being monitored. We also can do fluxes using closed chambers. So at the bottom, that's what a closed chamber looks like, is you have a set volume of air around the plants and soil. You have 2 tubes, an intake tube and an output tube, and those tubes go to a greenhouse gas analyzer. There is a new synthesis forthcoming from our methane working group led by my colleague Arian Arias Ortiz. It says in prep there, but it's actually in review right now. So I'm really hoping, once again, I can make good news announcements soon on that. The pros of this type of measurement are that they can be deployed at a wider scale than flux towers. So if you want to say like, hey, we have this big footprint flux tower, but we want to know how much these different elevation zones or these different veg communities are contributing, you could potentially combine those 2 methods and put together a more full picture of the heterogeneity within your big footprint measurements. They typically, this data set has wider spatial coverage. Like when you look at the Ameriflux database versus our chamber synthesis, we have a lot more chamber data than we have eddy covariance data. And the other pro is that lateral flux isn't as big of an issue because you have such a small footprint. You can assume anything that's washing out is kind of also washing in at that small scale. The cons of this data is typically these are not continuous data. You have much smaller footprint, so it introduces spatial heterogeneity, and it still requires trained personnel and expensive specialized equipment. Though that expense is less so than with eddy covariance towers. I assumed that there would be a lot more data in California, but when I looked at the actual synthesis, it's not. We have like 5 sites in California with flux chamber measurements, even though countrywide and globally, this is much more of a prevalent way of measuring things. Next slide, please. Lateral flux. Lateral flux includes both dissolved organic carbon from decay of plant material and leaching, and dissolved inorganic carbon, which is produced, which is in the form of bicarbonate or alkalinity, and that's produced by the sulfate reduction that's happening in the wetland soils. DIC, or dissolved inorganic carbon, is typically measured or typically modeled using multiple regression on water quality parameters on a water quality gauge. And with that, you need a water budget that comes from a water level logger and a tidal flood level footprint inferred from that logger and a high resolution digital elevation model. These get calibrated with grab sampling events. Some of the pros of having this measurement out there is that dissolved inorganic carbon, especially export, is a major uncounted portion of the tidal wetland carbon budget. And it's also potentially, it's a potential carbon removal that right now is not in any accounting framework. So if you reestablish, reconnect a wetland that is, a tidal, like a historical saline tidal wetland, but has either been drained or is been artificially freshened by impoundments. If you reconnect that and reestablish sulfate removal, you can be reducing methane, reestablishing carbon burial, and restarting this alkalinity export. So that third thing is currently under study right now. Some of the cons of this measurements is that there are large uncertainties introduced by methodology, by calibration, and by uncertainty in that water budget. Scalability, Kevin Kroger from USGS currently has a NASA carbon monitoring system that is focused on putting together the current lateral flux data and doing some modeling and some mapping to try to scale up estimates of lateral flux. Currently, there are 3 sites in California with full lateral flux characterization, but that's changing, and I think there will be 4 soon. That's just gossip and rumors, I hear. Next slide, please. Elevation change, yes. Lydia mentioned that these were typically measured using surface elevation tables and marker horizons. Some of the pros of these data sets is we have a really good established record for California, and this is also good for these short and midterm elevation dynamics. Cons, that there's some uncertainty introduced by individual technicians, and there's no centralized database for SET data the same way that there is for carbon stock and accumulation rate data, like the Coastal Carbon Atlas. But we do have 16 sites in California run by US Geological Survey. This is Karen Thorne's group. Karen just published a paper a few months ago that's kind of like the first 10 years of this SET network. I think I tried to find the data, and I think it still needs to be made public. So I'm going to be on the lookout for kind of the big USGS data release of this stuff. Next slide, please. Okay, so pivoting now from, I would say like that, those data sets I was just talking about, those are the response variables, or those are the things that we want to be able to predict using our models. So I'm going to be pivoting a little bit to models right now, but I will still talk about data a little bit as it relates to parameterizing these models. So as part of this pivot, I want to talk out a few points about what do we want the model to be able to do. And once again, this is kind of just my opinion, but it's also kind of feedback from talking to all of you. So the first thing I think is that we want the models to be able to determine places and times that are a priority for action. We want the models to be simple enough to be transferable from one location to another. So we don't want to have to rely on any very site-specific parameterizations. But we do want the models to be complex enough to represent real geographic variability in wetlands. And then at the scale of an individual wetland parcel, we might want to be able to determine what the likelihood of marsh persistence or collapse is, to determine whether carbon accumulation will increase, decrease, or stay the same in response to sea level rise and other global change factors. And we want to be able to evaluate the ramifications of planned management decisions. Next slide, please. So the model I'm going to be talking about the most is, I'll call it the marsh equilibrium model family, because we've heard a lot of names. We've heard MEM, we've heard SWEM, we've heard warmer. A lot of these models do the same thing and have very similar architecture, but some small details are different. And so a lot of what I show here, imagine that models being mostly interchangeable or able to be swapped out with one of those algorithms, because you know, what I'm going to be saying here could be generalizable to different types of models in this family, as long as they kind of have these things in common. So the MEM family was developed over time. It was originated by Jim Morris at University of South Carolina, and was developed and had different branching versions from his collaborators. The important things to know about this model is that we assume a parabolic relationship between biomass productivity and tidal elevation. So this means that for any given plant species at any given site, that they have an inundation level that they are happiest at, and they will try to maintain their own best, happiest conditions by modulating their own elevation. We also have feedback between flooding and sedimentation. As marshes get lower in the tidal frame, they are exposed to more water volume, and thus are exposed to more sediment and have the capacity to trap additional sediment. So these two drivers, these feedbacks between elevation and both the organic inputs and the mineral inputs come together in a cohort system. So the cohorts, you know, the cohorts track the different mass pools in the soil. So every year, a mineral layer is laid down, and then for every year that you run the model, each of those mineral layers gets tracked. As those mineral layers get buried, they get root material injected into them, and so they grow. And then every year the root mass turns over, and so they grow because of root turnover. And then as they kind of move, you can think of it almost as moving, the root zone moving through, or them moving through the root zone. A lot of that organic matter starts decaying, and so they'll shrink again. And the cohort section of the model is essentially a lot of accounting on where all of these mass pools are and how they change relative to the depth structure. So that's how we think of both the above ground and the below ground components of this system in this model. Next slide, please. Some of the benefits of this model is that first, the parameters in this model can be directly informed by measurements. This is a point-based model, but it can be applied spatially. Like, you can use this to simulate like an elevation transect. That's as complicated as I've gotten with it, but you could go even more complicated. You could sort of create like a two-dimensional mesh and sort of say, like, you know, some of these parameters are going to be a function of elevation, some from distance from open water, and you could potentially run this as a 2D mesh. It's very flexible, and it runs very quick. It works on annual time steps, and it predicts carbon stock change, carbon stock change, and elevation change, given a sea level rise and a sediment scenario. One of the things I'm most proud about my work the last few years ago is that this model is now publicly available as an R package. The R package is highly modular, and it is under an open, a Creative Commons Level 4 license. So this is a highly remixable model and very flexible. So even if there's some details about the model that you're not interested in or you don't like, you can always use this code base as a jumping off point for the next iteration of this model. There are some things in the, I will say, just in response to Lydia, that things that maybe the model hasn't done in the past, or but I specifically wrote into this package ways to do it. Things like having multiple species, like you can simulate a high and low marsh at the same time. You can, it takes like a manual switch you have to throw in it, but you can throw in an invasive species if you want. And it will simulate some competition dynamics. Some things like it can do, like if you use it to simulate an elevation transect, you can see it make predictions about upland transgression and edge loss in terms of the seaward edge. If we wanted to talk, we can get into this more later. I would believe the upland migration as it is now if you had specific enough parameters about what the growing tolerance was of those high marsh species. I wouldn't necessarily take the edge loss at face value. I think that would take more model development. That's a bit of a tangent, but it just goes to show that me and my group have tried to make this thing as flexible and open as possible, and to not give people, not just give people like a model that they can use, but to give people modules that they can pick and choose from and that they can customize as they need. Next slide, please. Some of the drivers of this model are inundation. We use tidal amplitude. There are 2 tidal floods a day in California. These can be simplified into datums, that is, average water levels. So we use mean sea level, mean high water, which is kind of that lower peak flood event per day, mean higher high water, which is the higher flood event of a day. And we can look at spring tides too, which are the 2 highest floods of the month. There are north-south trends in California where the further north you go, you tend to get wider tidal amplitudes or tidal ranges. And there are also kind of up estuary trends where the further you go up an estuary, you tend to get lower tidal amplitudes. As far as where we get this data from, NOAA has 113 gauges in California, which have varying levels of data quality, but do produce tidal datums. Kind of zooming out to the more medium-term dynamics, we look at 18.6-year lunar nodal dynamics. So stay with me, this gets nerdy. It has to do with the tilt of the moon's orbit, but it actually modulates the tidal amplitude on an 18.6-year time scale. And there's been papers that show if you have an upswing in the lunar nodal cycle at the same time you have an upswing in local sea level rise, you can potentially get like really, really bad nuisance flooding events. And, so this is something I keep my eye on in terms of marsh dynamics. Is this going to be like a major hotspot in terms of something that we have to keep our eye on in terms of marsh management? There are north-south trends in the nodal dynamics too. I don't remember off the top of my head what they are. There's only so much I can keep in my brain. And there are also within and without estuary trends. When you have kind of closed estuaries, it dampens this nodal effect, and you don't really see it inside the San Francisco Bay, but you do see it outside of the San Francisco Bay. There are currently 12 NOAA gauges that have long-term data, enough long-term data to fit these nodal modulation curves. Finally, we have localized sea level rise. They say all politics is local. Well, all sea level is local too. Sea level rise can vary locally based on ocean physics and based on local geography. In California, we have north-south trends, where the further north you go, the lower your localized sea level rise tends to be. The further south you go, the higher your localized sea level rise tends to be. So in addition to having past trends from NOAA, long-term sea level rise records for 12 tide gauges, we also have probabilistic scenarios of localized sea level rise. I'm using ones by Robert Kopp et al. From 2014. They model sea level rise, local sea level rise based on different realized concentration pathways. These are climate scenarios that indicate more and less severe ongoing emission scenarios. And I would argue that all of these are fairly straightforward to scale because they are highly spatial, and we can use spatial statistics if we're careful to interpolate between gauges. Next slide, please. Another driver that we have to input into the model is suspended sediment concentration. USGS is the big player in town when it comes to suspended sediment concentration. They have 40 gauges where you can calculate long-term average suspended sediment concentration. In terms of how we scale this to ungauged sites, I think we need to do a lot of work here. This could involve, like right now, for my kind of proof of concept work, I just use watershed classifications, like sort of say like, is this a low sediment watershed, a high sediment watershed, a medium sediment watershed? But I think we need to get more advanced and start modeling based on watershed characteristics. I've seen some people try to use remote sensing to try to get at this. And of course, USGS runs the Sparrow model, which has a sediment component to it. I'm just kind of throwing stuff out there. I don't know how well any of this would work, but I think that this is a real, like a sticking point right now in terms of scaling this model up. It will also be critical to kind of get experts involved in creating the scenarios that we want to develop for evaluating potential management options, like simulating tidal reintroduction or doing the sediment augmentation that Lydia was talking about. Sorry, do we have a question? I think I've been talking for a while and you've had your hand up. Matt Holmes.
Oh, can I talk? Awesome. For the instrumentation for this suspended sediment concentration work, do you need to be a geologist to pull like a well permit for a data logger? Like, how complex is it to place the remote sensing work?
For the remote sensing work, I think what I'm thinking about is Kristen Bird's study, and they did grab sampling. That was all in San Francisco Bay, like in the sites that Lydia was showing, like all around Rust Ranch.
So nobody's gone up creek and done instrumentation of the deep estuary or the feeders?
Oh, I don't know.
For your knowledge, okay.
I know that there's kind of 40 long-term gauges that you can do the long-term stuff with. There's probably a ton of short-term and grab sampling out there. I'm just doing my best with the data sets I have at my disposal.
Yeah, well, I think there's a real need for a surface transport model to talk about how this stuff gets pushed around throughout the Delta, especially when people are burying supercritical CO2 under it and need to know how the pH variation is going to impact all of this. Very interesting work. Thank you.
All right. Since we're taking a quick break, any other quick questions? All right, let's keep moving through. Sorry if I'm taking a long time, but I'm trying to cover a whole bunch of data sets and a couple different models all at once. But I think we might be at the road home here. Next slide, please. For initial conditions, Lydia mentioned a lot of this, but we have the best thing to have is on-site survey grade GPS. We have that for 15 sites in California. And scalability is possible using light detection and ranging based digital elevation models. I'll say LiDAR DEMs. LiDAR, Lydia also mentioned this, introduces some bias to marsh surfaces because of just the dense vegetation and the fact that the wet soil absorbs a lot of the power of the laser. So it results in a smearing effect and a pretty persistent bias for wetland surfaces. The lean algorithm exists. This was developed by Kevin Buffington and Karen Thorne to correct that based off of vegetation greenness indices from high resolution remote sensing. I've used lean in one of my papers and collaborated with Kevin on a paper. I think it works great. But one of my critiques or something I would like to see going forward is an implementation of lean that has a correction outside of the calibration site with higher uncertainty. So right now, there, as far as I know, lean's only being applied where you have ground data, and we're going to need it everywhere. So doing that in a conscientious way and moving the uncertainty through that process I think is going to be key. Next slide, please. So for the parameters of the model, we need to essentially establish what the points are in that biomass and inundation parabola. For this, one thing we do is we use these mesocosm experiments called marsh organs. They're called that because they look like pipe organs. Some of the pros of these data sets are they're really good at defining kind of the peak and the lower end of the growing tolerance. The cons are is that they don't always constrain the upper growing limit of the high marsh species. It turns out if you are not shading out a high marsh with trees or upland vegetation, they're happy to keep growing. They don't care. So one thing that I'm a big, and we have 2 of these marsh organ studies in California in a public, in a synthesis data set that I'm currently working up to putting out. We also have direct surveys of both plant presence and absence and vegetation. Some of the pros of these are they're good at determining that upper growing limit of plants. Cons, they're usually only presence data, not presence absence data, which is kind of a pain, but you take what you can get. There are 9 sites in California with elevation and species presence data, and 4 sites with paired elevation and biomass data. For scalability, we really need some testing on how we're going to, assign these marsh growing parameters outside of monitored sites. I think that some species we can simplify them into functional groups like high marsh, low marsh, invasive grass, and I have a hypothesis that some of these peak and upper growing tolerances can be a predictable function of tidal properties, but that needs testing and more work. But free hypothesis to anyone who wants to dig in. Next page, please. For parameters, we investigated a lot of we put together data for a lot of below ground traits. I'm kind of salty about this stuff. You might see. We have to fit relationships for above to below ground biomass ratios, below ground turnover rates, and root depth maximum. I have an in-prep synthesis that builds a lot on the fine roots database run by Department of Energy. Some of the pros of this data, that it exists, but the cons are that they're all incredibly variable based on method, and they're all very hard to measure. So I would say scalability here needs a lot of work. We need a lot more data in order to understand kind of site to site and species to species level variation. But when in doubt, I say we can always use broad, like wide values informed by multi-species meta-analysis and expert elicitation. Next slide, please. Finally, we have decomposition is pretty important in this model. We use a 2-pool model using a slow pool fraction, essentially a fraction of the deposited organic matter that remains fairly stable over like 100 to 1,000-year timescales. And we use an exponential decomposition rate. I have another in-prep synthesis of litter bag experiments. It's not very authoritative. It's mostly what was available, like what was easy to find in the literature. The pros of these studies are that they're direct measurements. The cons are, there's probably a lot more data out there that I haven't had time to put together. And there are a few very long-term studies like that go over 2 years long. So when you fit these relationships, you do get a lot of uncertainty in the parameters. As far as scalability goes, we need some more testing to see how far this can scale up. There are strong but site-dependent relationships between slow pool fractionation and depth, but I think we need testing to see whether relationships between temperature, tidal elevation, and soil type can provide predictive values for these parameters. Next slide, please. So how does it all come together? It all comes together. So the way that I work is I treat all of the initial conditions, all of the drivers, all of the parameters, and the modeled values themselves as unknowns. And I sample them using Monte Carlo sampling. That means you run a lot of different parameter sets, a lot of different configurations. You keep the configurations that work and you throw out the ones that don't work. So what we see here is the results of a case study that I'm getting ready to publish for, or that I'm getting ready to submit for a wetland near Annapolis, Maryland. We see the blue lines. These are 25 randomly selected permutations of the model. I think they show pretty good agreement between the model and the data. The data are those white lines or the white box in terms of elevation. And those gray bars is essentially a statistical compromise between the modeled values and the model uncertainty and the measured values and the measured uncertainty. So I'm very proud of this, but like I said, this could be any modeled value, and I think or any type of model, but the important thing that I want to be putting out here is having a standardized way that we can evaluate models that takes into account all sources of uncertainty, not just one or two. Next slide, please. So that's a hindcast. That's us building, making predictions of the past and looking at how well our model does. We can also drive this model into the future. And what we see here is carbon accumulation rate through the hindcast and then into a 100-year forecast. And the same with elevation. The median scenario would be the very center of all those bands, and each band is a cumulative source of uncertainty. So looking at the uncertainty related to the initial elevation you started it at, the parameters themselves, the model itself, and the scenario that you run it over. So what we see here in Annapolis is that carbon accumulation capacity decreases in the future as marsh collapse likelihood increases. And that uncertainty is dominated by the initial conditions and the parameters early on. And as we get closer to today, the model itself and the parameters introduce the most uncertainty. And as we go into the future, the uncertainty in the sea level rise scenario itself is driving uncertainty in the model. Next slide, please. We can also run sensitivity analyses on our models to see where the squeaky wheel that needs the oil is. So we see that our forecasts are very sensitive to uncertainty in parameters relevant to plant productivity and slow pool allocation. And this could be very different for mineral dominated wetlands. This is a more organic dominated wetland. Next slide, please. I'll talk a little bit, just a couple slides on the peppermint model. This is a model that was developed by my colleague Patty Okawa, so Peppermint Patty. Peppermint predicts CO2 and methane fluxes on finer timescales than MEM works on, like 30 minutes to daily timescales. It takes a few additional inputs, such as growing season dynamics, salinity, and nitrate concentration, but it can be linked with MEM providing information on plant productivity, and Peppermint providing the methane production and transport mechanisms. Me and Patty are both part of a project I mentioned earlier, Kevin Kroger's NASA Carbon Monitoring System project, and she is further developing Peppermint to integrate lateral fluxes. Next slide, please. I have some results on behalf of Patty to show here. Peppermint has been run on independent data for 5 tidal wetland sites. The model explains about 54% of the variation in methane emissions for this site, which is it's okay for complex environmental models, and it gives us a benchmark with which to improve against. So this is all in review right now. Hoping for good news. Next slide. So just a couple things to close with. When we're talking about upscaling and thinking about mapping needs, Lydia mentioned this, but I'll say it again. I think we need more bias corrected elevation maps statewide. We need more continuous salinity mapping. The salinity maps we have make the split between high and low methane emitting wetlands at the exact wrong spot. We need moderate scale vegetation green up and dieback dynamic maps, and we need nitrate maps. Some of this is in development in my lab right now, but it's all at a prototype stage, and we don't have too many people working on this. So could use more people who want to work on this, use more funding and investment. But anyways, next slide, please. Some of the data needs I see, I think we really need ongoing support for growing and maintaining these synthesis products I've been telling you about. I have Kurt Vonnegut here because he is one of my favorite quotes. Everybody wants to build, nobody wants to do maintenance. I think we need to do some maintenance on this stuff. We need more information on restoring sites, more dated cores with survey grade elevation outside of San Francisco Bay, and much more synthesis and field data produced across the board, especially for below ground plant trait data and decomposition processes. Next slide. In terms of model development needs, I could use some professional help to optimize this code and make it run faster. We need more testing against independent out of sample data and more case studies for providing decision support for management interventions. Next slide. So what does an ideal monitoring site look like? I think we need before after intervention control monitoring, stratified sampling to interface with kind of the minimum resolution of moderate level remote sensing, like 10 to 30 meters. We're not going to be able to monitor every site, so we're going to have to connect these ground observations to remote sensing. We can do that with some conscientious sampling design. We need more full carbon budgets, including long-term carbon accumulation rates, short-term stock changes, short-term fluxes, lateral fluxes, and elevation dynamics. We need ongoing studies to improve general site-specific predictability of plant ecology, biomass decay, and sedimentation. And we need publicly available, quality controlled, and low latency data sets. Low latency meaning a small amount of time possible between collecting and publishing data. I think the National Estuarine Research Reserves are a good model for this, and they do great work. I love working with them, so I'll put in a plug for them. As part of our existing research infrastructure, I recommend we build on. Final slide, please. Just a couple conclusions. I think that we have data sets and models in hand that we need to make predictions with propagated uncertainty today. There are limitations to scaling a lot of these, but I think these problems are tractable. We do need investment for maintaining data pipelines, for providing more information on species and site level variation, for key plant decomposition traits, for mapping key drivers, for speeding up models, and providing case studies, integrating forecasts into adaptive management plans. And future monitoring should focus on before-after intervention control style monitoring. We should have more full suites of coupled elevation change and greenhouse gas flux monitoring, in interfacing with moderate resolution remote sensing so that we can understand the carbon cycle implications of coastal restoration in California and project the permanence of carbon stored by new management actions. Thanks, everyone. I'm so sorry that my talk ended up being so long, but yeah, as you can see, there's a lot of detail to go into.
All right, well, Lori has stepped off, and so I just want to thank Lydia and James for speaking on this topic. We definitely received a good overview of wetland systems and what we know, what we don't know, and good frameworks from which to ask questions. And then hopefully James's talk will be helpful during the parameterization process, seeing what is known, what is not known, what uncertainties come from it. I want to take a moment also to check in on the time. I know that there's another presentation from George Mean, and we're at 3 o'clock or almost 3 o'clock. So we had talked about taking a break potentially, but where is it?
Yeah, I think we could take a break, which, you know, we're doing this for a while, and come back and have some discussion, and then probably by 3:45 to 4, we switch over to the presentation.
Okay, so yeah, because I definitely want to make sure we have time to ask questions from everybody. Yeah. Okay. All right,
Now maybe 10 minutes.
so we'll be back here at 3:01.
Yeah.
Okay. You can ask her questions. The nitrous.
Right.
I'm kidding around. Kidding around.
Like there's still all these.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, switch all. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, hey,
Hey, how are you? You guys gonna start planning?
Yes,
today.
I was curious. I just heard about it.
I'm shared with the
Yeah, right, you gotta.
Okay, are we all here? Okay, so at this time, we'd like to open it up to questions from the panel to the speakers. And if there is time, we would also like to open it up questions from the team from ARB to also ask questions because I think their presentations were really relevant to your work. So, does anybody in the panel, either online or here in the room, have any questions? John, you mentioned you had to start.
So thank you very much, Jim and Lydia. Those were great overviews and really sets the stage for what the state can do. As you highlighted, there has been a lot more focus on San Francisco Bay in terms of data collection and other things. But what do you see as how easily could the data and the models be grown from San Francisco Bay to incorporate coastal wetlands? As you highlighted, Jim, there are some data, but even, without the data, how different are the systems on the coast compared to the bay?
Let's see. I think, it's hard to tell. I would have to really dig into a lot of the data to look into that. I think that the big differences you could see would be drawing hypothesis here. I imagine you'd see a big difference in terms of suspended sediment concentration and a lot more, I don't know, I'm guessing more watershed to watershed variability in coastal California because the sediment input sources are also different depending on where you are. But I don't know. I guess I'm freestyling here. I don't have a huge. I haven't really worked too much into the Bay Area wetlands. When I was out there in the marsh, I was really I was really doing a lot of Southern and Northern California sampling. So I don't know, John. Do you have thoughts on this? I think you're the one here who's worked in both systems.
My feeling is the vegetation community is very similar, except in Northern California where Spartina drops out. So that I agree. I think there's some physical differences, but it seems like the model should be relatively transferable. I don't see dramatic differences.
No, I don't think so either. I think that the thing the model would show you the most, and what I think that warmer study does from Karen Thorne's 2018 paper is show those north to south trends in increasing vulnerability in tidal wetlands that are further south, both because you have slimmer tidal amplitudes and because you have higher local rates of sea level rise.
So I see that Matt has said.
And Lydia.
Yeah, I was going to say that maybe Lydia, if you would like to if you have a response to this question, Matt, if you could just hold for a moment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Really quick response. I don't have a ton to add, except that one thing to take into account is that the models that have been developed and the data that have been collected, I would not apply them to intermittent estuaries or barbelt estuaries elsewhere in the state. So it's more just a word of caution that there are certain types of estuaries that you'll find around the state that open and close intermittently to the tides that really function differently in a way that data from these fully tidal non-intermittent estuaries, I would not take those data and those models and apply them sort of across the whole system without considering some of those types of dynamics.
Okay, Matt, would you like to ask? And you're muted right now.
Thank you for helping me. It sounds like, this is a huge problem with so many variables that data sharing and all hands on deck and partnership researchers are essential. I have experiences in some of these rituals where data sharing is difficult. Are you encountering any barriers in acquiring diverse data sets from either state agencies or regional agencies, and how can we help streamline that? And then I want to help collect data too.
I'll take a first stab, which is to say we do have, as I mentioned, we have regional monitoring programs around the state, and they're not necessarily collecting the types of data that this group wants. I think some of the data types are very much applicable, but to my knowledge, none of them are really focused currently on carbon and greenhouse gases. The San Francisco Bay Wetland Regional Monitoring Program would like to do that and is aiming to do it in the future, but fundamentally it's a funding issue. They have funding that's tied to the specific management objectives that their monitoring is tied to. And I think there's a lot of interest. And I think that's kind of ultimately the bottom line is there are a lot of people out there who have the skills and the interests, and they can only monitor what they are explicitly funded to monitor. So I think connecting the dots is a matter of, you know, connecting with the folks who are already out there doing these, making these measurements and kind of having a focused funding stream towards the management questions of concern.
You know, that's exactly what I'm getting at. I think the silos are where they get us and where the information sharing and the initiative fall apart. And then just as a final question, maybe a statement. Are you able to identify any sort of priority projects or strategies that you don't need a model to prove, right? Like the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago type stuff. Urgent conservation priorities that address, you know, all of the criteria, water quality issues, but also most vulnerable communities, and how are the social sciences being considered in evaluating vulnerability? I know it's a big question, but I just want to get it on the record and then say, let's find us a social scientist.
Jim, I see that your hand's up. Did you want to tackle this or the previous question? I also have some thoughts on Matt's latest question.
Well, I saw Mel's hand was up, so I wanted to let you go first if you wanted to.
I'm happy to let you answer Matt's question first. I was going to ask you both like a slightly different question, so if you want to take that, I can go next.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll take a step back to the first question, which was on data sharing. Do we find difficulty with data sharing? Yes, but you know, I've been kind of a professional convincer of people to share their data for like 6 years now. So I think I've learned a lot about how to do it. And what I've learned is like, people tend to be very open to sharing their data, but there are so many hurdles to getting it there. First, I think that the thing that I'm very proud of with Coastal Carbon Network is our data use policy, which says if you are going to use a data set in our synthesis, you don't cite the synthesis, you cite the original data set. So every data set in our library has primary citations associated with that the users need to cite, so that we can keep that kind of that chain of custody documented and get recognition for the original researchers who produced that data. That's really important in academia, and it helps incentivize the people to participate, knowing that they'll be credited and they won't be kind of forgotten about. The other thing is people don't have, researchers tend to not have a lot of training in how to manage data and present it for other people to reuse. So me and my team have taken on a lot of, I would say, like curatorial, like the job of curating data. But we also we do engage in training events sometimes and we especially engage early career researchers trying to see these best or what I call good enough data management practices throughout the community, because the early career researchers, the grad students, the postdocs are the ones who are publishing this data. If we can get well-documented, citable data publications from these early career researchers, then we'll be saving ourselves so much headache in the long term, because data sets decay. Like every time you see a paper that says data available upon request, the longer that paper's been out, there's an exponential decline in how likely you are to get that data if you write it. So,
and I just want to comment on that because I'm involved with another agency on the state scoping plan, and the modeling platform has been hard to find the levers and switches on for third-party researchers, and it's because it is a lift for staff to be able to sort of weave all that stuff together and respond to everybody's sort of big idea. And so I think we really need to find a way to break down barriers between agencies who base meaningful policy and administrative decisions on models, which are flexible tools, and the questions we ask determine the answers we get. And would love to see a federal state partnership to help all of our state agencies understand that once you put out a model, you got to let other people play with it. Otherwise, it leads to a whole host of confidence issues. So thank you for that work.
So this is Carrie. I'm going to step in real quickly and take Melissa's comment and input or question, and then I want to return the opportunity to the room to ask some questions. Melissa.
Yeah, sure. I guess I have kind of two questions. Well, first of all, thank you, Jim and Lydia. That was really great to hear all of that information. I'm curious, a little bit similar to what Matt was asking, like spatially, where are some of the biggest opportunities? I mean, those sea level rise maps you showed, Lydia, are super interesting, but like if we were to look towards target areas for opportunity, do we have a sense of where those would be? Like, are there some areas where we know there's a large marsh with managed area for retreat that is unprotected, that if you looked across the state, if you had all the information, do we know like what the best target spots would be? And then I guess in tandem with that, do we know what the best target approaches would be? Like, is it simply a matter of protecting those key areas that are available for retreat, or are there places where like levees could be, like tidal reconnection that could change things, or the thin sediment layer placement? Like, I feel like what we know now is that more holistic sediment management approaches are better than just putting plants in the ground, for example, if you can look on a wider scale. But I'm wondering if we know exactly where and how those priorities would be.
A big question, and it's a really good question. And I am not going to be able to give a clear answer right now as to like X, Y, and Z or the perfect places that we should be looking. What I will say was that there is a report that was put out several years ago by TNC. It's their Hope for the Coast report that does look at conservation status of migration space statewide. So that's one place to start. And then there have been regional assessments also evaluating migration opportunities. In terms of which types of management strategies it is a multi-dimensional problem, because it's, for one thing, you have to look at kind of where there are opportunities to restore marshes that aren't likely to immediately erode. And there is certainly local scale knowledge. I'm much more familiar with San Francisco Bay than other areas around the state, but local scale knowledge on sort of where the more erosional regions are, subregions are within those areas. And I think to actually identify the appropriate management strategies and actions, the path forward is to work with regional programs and regional regulatory staff in particular. I know the water boards have a lot of this information and are pretty understaffed in terms of actually being able to kind of do that project development from the visioning stage all the way up through the permitting stage. I feel like there was a lot more to your question that I'm not getting at right now, but I would say using sort of the physical understanding we have of these estuaries to identify where is sort of likely opportunities for resilient restoration projects. And also another important consideration is that, I mean, we don't want to end up in a situation where we are building seawalls everywhere to fortify our marshes. So I think also considering where we already have soft shorelines versus where the shoreline is hardened. For instance, many restoration projects will breach a levee and leave that levee, the majority of that levee intact, to help protect against wave erosion. So those are situations where fortifying the levees with more gray infrastructure is a reasonable approach. So I think, you know, it's very much site specific. I think to actually implement these actions is going to take more than just a statewide view, but actually working closely with folks at the regional scale who understand the opportunities.
Thank you.
Jim, did you have a response to Melissa or a question? Because if it's a question, I want to come back to the room right here to let somebody else ask one.
No, just a quick response.
Okay.
I would say just that I don't have anything as holistic to say as what Lydia just said. But I do say that for the particular example of impounded wetlands that could potentially be reconnected to tidal flow, I did publish a paper earlier this year that put out some maps that are based on the National Wetlands Inventory. And it's kind of the low-hanging fruit of what is impounded and adjacent to a tidal wetland, and already on protected areas. So that's out there. It's a resource. We do know that those National Wetlands Inventory maps undermap impoundments. So a new set of techniques should be tested and could be tested. The other thing I was going to mention was about kind of opportunities. I think there's a lot of projects that are like a lot of projects just slated for habitat restoration right now, which don't have any funding or requirements to do long-term elevation or long-term carbon monitoring. And I think there's a lot of opportunities to piggyback off restoration plans and install more monitoring and get better information on what works, what doesn't, and what the carbon cycle implications of restoration are. I know in my backyard right here in Long Beach, we have a pretty sizable set of historical wetlands which have been drained and used as oil fields for the last 80 years that are going to be restored to wetland, and there's no funding or requirement for some of the holistic monitoring that I've been talking about on those sites.
Yeah, super interesting. Thanks, both of you. That's great.
So coming back to the room, just really quickly as a time check, we're at 3:20 and we also need to defer or let the public have questions. What do you suggest? That we spend 10 more minutes talking?
Yeah, I think we could keep going for another 10 minutes.
Okay, all right. So Laura, you had a question.
Yeah, I was struck by, thank you for your presentations, both by the comment that not much is known about the fate of eroded carbon. Was listed, I think, Lydia, as a science frontier. And I guess not being a person who works in this area, I guess I was just wondering qualitatively if carbon loss to erosion, so I assume this is particulate carbon that we're talking about, is expected to be lost more quickly back to the atmosphere once it's eroded, or is it possible that it could go the other way? I was just like, from a qualitative sense, I was just curious about the direction. And then also in terms of thinking about priorities, it would seem, given what you said about sea level rise and erosion, that avoiding erosion would be sort of a linchpin to meeting any targets that have to do with coastal wetlands and carbon. But I just wanted to confirm that this thing that is maybe a linchpin is the thing maybe we don't know a lot about in terms of how to estimate the carbon consequences of erosion.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Laura. And you are right. First of all, in terms of your kind of initial assessment of the concept, which is that as the marsh shoreward edge erodes, there's a loss of particulate carbon that had been stored in sediments and protected from decomposition that has the potential to be rapidly oxidized once it's released. That said, the actual fate of that carbon is not hugely well understood. There are some studies that I'm aware of out of the Gulf Coast that used radiocarbon and did not observe sedimentation of that eroded carbon elsewhere in the estuary, which is not a great sign in terms of the fate of that carbon. So there is some evidence that that carbon is rapidly mineralized after being eroded, but it still is not well understood in the universe of things. And in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, the approach that's used is based on the IPCC Tier 1 approach assumption, which is that the top meter of soil of sediment is lost, so the top meter of carbon. When a marsh shifts from being vegetated to unvegetated, is considered instantly gone from the system and instantly oxidized to CO2. That is likely a conservative assumption, but nonetheless, I do think you're right, Laura, that this is a really critical component of the carbon budget. And when we think about sort of what we need to account for in our wetlands, that potential loss of carbon is tremendous and has the potential to kind of like sink the wetland ship, so to speak. That said, I also want to acknowledge that while this group is sort of laser focused on carbon and greenhouse gases, pretty much almost the entire rest of the wetland world is focused on the many other benefits that wetlands provide for ecosystems and communities. And focusing all our efforts on shoring up the wetland edge may not ultimately prove the most fruitful in terms of keeping wetlands where they are and maintaining our wetland acreage. So I would just sort of soften that focus on this loss of carbon with the fact that we also need to really be thinking about marsh migration so that we can not just be thinking about carbon stocks, but also essentially it's what I call the all hands on deck method, where instead of necessarily armoring our entire shoreline, we're also focused on allowing marshes to migrate and just making sure that we can maintain our vegetated marshes.
So, Jim, do you have a follow-up response to that question? You're muted, yeah.
I just had a quick
also what-
follow-up to tag on something Lydia said, and that's in 2018, I put out a paper in Environmental Research Letters, which did a sensitivity analysis of the U.S. greenhouse gas inventory, and we found the assumptions that we were making about how much gets mineralized back to the atmosphere and the depth of soil losses were two of the biggest sources of uncertainty in the inventory.
It's also interesting what Lydia said, because I think that's something that we think about in agriculture, where we take care of the soils and other benefits come, but there's just a priority to keep the soil in place for crop production. So anyway, we still have about, can't see the time.
Yeah, I think we could probably go for another 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, all right. So does anybody else like to pose a question or follow up on anything that's been discussed?
Do you just staff have? Do you guys have
Yeah,
questions?
do you have any questions that you want to?
Yeah, I'll add one. I'll pick one from the list. So one of the things that's burning question for me, looking at this kind of going forward and trying to measure the impacts of restoration or activities in wetlands. Will we get to the point where some of these remote sensing models can pick up the elevational changes due to accretion? I mean, some of these LiDAR data sets I've seen have accuracies anywhere between 10 and 80 centimeters, right? That's really looking pretty far out based on some of the accretion values you put out there. So, I mean, you know, is that an accuracy? And, you know, can we get any closer with some of these kind of localized measurements scaled out?
I'll tackle this. As far as elevation measurements go, like I would say the kind of the classic airborne LiDAR DEM campaign that is kind of made to FEMA standards. I don't really see that as being a tool accurate enough to show elevation change, unless you had a very drastic event like a marsh collapse event. I could see LiDAR being used as a kind of a cursory tool to scale up, or as an intermediate tool in the case where you have very like a very local scan, or maybe not even LiDAR, but maybe like structure from motion from a drone. I could see that potentially being a good bridge between like very spatially limited but precise elevation measurements and kind of what's happening at a site scale. But that's kind of that's just a quick opinion.
Yeah, I was going to voice something similar, which is that I have not played with the data this way, and perhaps this is optimistic, but I would hope that LiDAR coupled with these point measurements like surface elevation tables could offer a way to scale point measurements, given the uncertainty in the LiDAR alone.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, can I ask one more question? Yeah. So just one more question here, right? We have this kind of prerogative to estimate the current carbon stock in these systems, right? And it sounds like the best method to do that is with hindcasting on these models. You know, that's great and all, except it seems like the models have this kind of focus on only natural processes, and these are wetlands that are already impacted by human activities and restoration events, right? So are there any studies that incorporate these kind of human impacts on this estimation on current carbon stocks within the wetlands?
Are you talking about scenario building? Is that what you're?
Yeah, we're not on the projection side though, but really looking at what's currently there, right? There are already activities on the land, and that seems like it would remove the ability to hindcast with some of the models that were discussed.
Let's see. I can't think of any studies off the top of my head. There aren't that many of these types of papers out there, and you're right that they are focused mostly on natural situations. As far as going, there might be some papers for like, I think that there is a paper which looked at some forecasting for restoration event in the Nisqually Delta up in Washington, but that's the one that I can think of. In terms of like going forward, well, if we were hindcasting something that had already been restored, then I think it could be possible, but it would take, you would have to integrate the restoration event into the scenario, essentially saying the tidal amplitude changed at this time, the suspended sediment changed at this time. And it could be done, and it might work and it might not, but it's possible. I think the thing that I'm more interested in right now, and the thing I think is more useful, is integrating the experts into the future forecasting to sort of say like, okay, what are the kind of like, if we're doing sediment augmentation, what would be a reasonable target of new suspended sediment concentration that would keep the marsh at this level of risk, you know, under this level of risk for collapse? Or, you know, how much sediment do we have just available, and like what would be a reasonable budget per year of putting out there and seeing seeing if it worked. That's the kind of thing I envision going forward.
I'll also add that, so hindcasts have been used essentially to test the models and see how well they perform against core data. And one thing to note is, it's good news for the models, is that they can reproduce things like the gold rush, which shows up pretty clearly in the sediment record. And just to say that in terms of being able to reproduce not just constant conditions in terms of anthropogenic impacts, these particular models have been shown to be able to recreate those sort of past human impacted events.
Will you send me a link to that gold rush study? I haven't seen that. That sounds cool.
Yeah, Jim Morris. It was in the Delta, so freshwater.
Oh, this has got to be new then, right? Did this just come out like a couple months ago?
I think it was 2021, but I'd be happy to send you a link, Jim.
So he's so prolific that he can have papers come out that I don't know about.
So,
Thank you very much.
Free researcher's dream. So I would just want to, Matt's had his hand up for a little while. I just want to give him a chance to ask his questions. And then I'm sure there's more data modeling questions out here in the audience as well. So Matt, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to be the broken record and highlight, elevate James's comment that we need to get to work and see what works on some things, and to give people, rest assurance that we don't, as we see with this problem, there's a lot of variables and we may not know exactly the most efficient, most technically calculus based project to start with, and that when we don't know that we have every right and obligation to default to the other things we know about California, which is the history of inequality in marginalized communities and overburdened communities. And starting there is not only the right thing to do, it's actually what we're required to do to comply with government code. And as an example, I'll bring up the 17,000 parcels of housing in Stockton's Conway Homes public housing unit, where there's an old levee and they built a bigger one on the other side of it because the developers went an extra 18 feet higher than the poor folks next door. And so that kind of hostile design is in record. There are plenty of examples to look at it. And I think it would be really great if people didn't get flooded out because somebody else had a tractor and they didn't. So we can prioritize historically overburdened communities, and I believe that we are legally obliged to do so.
Thanks, Matt, for bringing that up, making sure it's in the record for us.
Yeah, I'll say NOAA has a good layer in their sea level rise tool, which you can cross-reference. You can cross-reference some social indices with sea level rise scenarios, and that's a resource there.
I thought Melissa was going to say something. Okay, so anybody here in the team?
I had a question, going back to the conversation about LiDAR detecting changes in elevation, and not to put anyone on the spot, but do you happen to know like a general magnitude of elevation change you might anticipate in like a, I don't know, 5-year span or even 2-year span, just to like get an idea of the level of precision that is ideal for these elevation change detection methods?
Yeah, I'd say in about 5 years, you wouldn't really get more than like 1.5 centimeters of accretion if it was if it's a low, slow accreting wetland. If it's a wetland that washes away or has a collapse event, I mean, I really don't know. They say 1 meter gets washed away with the IPCC scenarios, and that could be a conservative number. So that's why I said you're much more likely to be able to see big loss events with LiDAR than you are to see kind of background levels of accretion. So if you're getting like 1.5 centimeters of accretion in 5 years, you know, you're not going to see that with LiDAR, where the random error or the bias can be like 18 centimeters and the random error can be like 10.5 centimeters.
But that set method does capture a centimeter and a half.
Oh yeah. Well, they're out there. They're really zeroing in on the exact same points, taking very fine pin measurements with those pins. So yeah, that's one of the things with SETs that is a big deal, is that you need a long record to really show elevation change. And this is one of those situations where we really did plant trees 10 years ago. Like the sets that USGS runs and Karen Thorne runs have been going for 10 years, and they're a huge asset to California, I think.
Oh, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I completely agree with Jim on natural marshes, but in restored marshes, especially in highly subsided sites, they can accumulate a lot more. I mean, the salt ponds in the South Bay accumulated 20 centimeters in years.
Okay.
So the restored sites are different, and especially the low elevation restored sites. And that, in that case, I think LiDAR could be used for the monitoring of restored sites in their early development. But once they get to be a vegetated marsh, then they slow down dramatically, like Jim highlighted.
I agree with that. Thanks for the. I'll take that correction, John.
No, just a different scenario, different condition.
So my question is based on kind of the empirical data that you have on carbon fluxes and stocks. And Jim, when you were showing, you showed like 5 sites with eddy covariance, and maybe 4 sites that do kind of in situ gas chambers, and then 70 some odd soil cores, basically. And it seemed like spatially the distribution was fairly in the Bay Area and concentrated. And that also just doesn't feel like a lot of empirical data to begin with, and especially with how like regionally specific it is. So I'm wondering if you can kind of comment on how limited we are in empirical data. And then Lydia was commenting about perhaps like the inability to expand models beyond the Bay Area, especially if we don't have empirical data as much from other places.
Sure. Well, you know, when I was talking about the number of data sets we have, that's only for California. We've got a lot more data sets for the Pacific Coast, for the Gulf Coast, for the East Coast. So if you're willing to, and for the globe. So if you're willing to kind of expand the range at which you're willing to look at these processes, you know, we've got a lot of information. It's not always together, and it takes a lot to go through. But, you know, we've got a good amount to start with. I would say that there are some places where we have a very spatially representative amounts of data that is easy to collect and maybe is not of the highest descriptive value. So things like carbon stock estimates, things like plant presence absence data, that's stuff that we have a lot of, and we have good spatial representativeness for. Things that are harder to collect, like this really elaborate flux work. When I said, like, you know, we have this many sites for this measurement, for this many sites for this, most of those are overlapping. So we kind of have, I would say, 4 very well monitored sites in California. That would be Rush Ranch, Hill Slough, Eden Landing, and and the one in Monterey Bay. I'm forgetting what it's called right now. My brain's a little. Elkhorn Slough, yeah. So those are the places where we have this really intensive monitoring. So would I like to see those? I would like to see those kinds of stage, like to have a lot more of that kind of monitoring. But I don't think the fact that we don't have it is an obstacle to us starting the process of making reasonable predictions based on everything we do know. I think if we are explicit in how we treat uncertainty in these input data sets and these models, we can come out with defensible scenarios that give us something to iterate on and improve upon.
Yeah, I completely agree with Jim's response. And I just wanted to clarify that while the majority of our data or many of our data come from the Bay Area, I don't think that's a reason we can't extend our models elsewhere in the state. I think that really depends on the parameter data sets, as Jim was just describing. I think where we have to be cautious is applying the models to different estuary types. Like we would not want to take the models that we have and apply them in a barbelled estuary somewhere else in the state. So that's a limited case. But broadly speaking, I think we can look elsewhere in the state. And one other sort of minor point I wanted to mention is that where the flux data, I think, are particularly relevant are with respect to methane emissions. And one gap that we do have is that all of those towers that Jim just mentioned come from saline to brackish sites, and we don't have any towers in freshwater wetlands in the Delta. And, you know, there have been many measurements made in other systems across other sites, but that is, if we're looking specifically to monitoring data from California, that's one data point that we don't have. That said, one tower in a freshwater wetland is not going to tell the whole story anyway. So that's where looking to the models like Patty Oikawa's peppermint model is going to at least get us somewhere.
So I'd like to pause right here. We're at 3:43. We had one more question in the room, but then we might need to draw a line under it. But I was looking at you to see if you could.
Yeah, I think we can maybe do one more question in here, then go to public comment.
Okay, sounds good. So, don't remember your name.
Lee.
Lee. Okay, so you had a question.
So I cut my teeth in the deposition world where people talked a lot about nitrogen and how watersheds can leak nitrogen when there's too much deposition, and they generally kind of hang on to their nitrogen and don't export it. What's your sense in terms of what's coming through these marshlands and going out to sea versus what they're retaining and accreting in terms of the carbon budget? And so, you know, are these marshlands sipping from a fire hose and keeping like 1% of the carbon and laying that down in these estuaries, and the rest is escaping out to sea with some unknown fate? Or are our streams and rivers basically exporting very little, and the marshlands are holding on to most of it, and we're not leaking too much out to sea? That's sort of a big picture. It could be naive. I'm a forest guy, so.
Let's see. I could talk a little bit about nitrogen first. So nitrogen can boost. Nitrogen can have some crazy effects on marshes. It can increase productivity, yeah, but it can also affect the below ground to above ground biomass allocation. So if you have nitrogen pollution, you could have plants that say, I'm getting plenty of nitrogen, and I don't have to put too many roots down. So you can get kind of contradictory signals on that. Jim Morris showed some fertilization effects that were potentially pretty interesting in some of his studies. But at the Global Change Research Wetland that we run out at Smithsonian, there have been like decades of both CO2 enrichment and nitrogen enrichment. And I'd have to dig into some of those studies, but I think my impression was that the sea level rise effects were just kind of swamping out any effect you'd see from nitrogen or CO2 fertilization. In terms of how much carbon they hold on to versus how much gets eroded back out, that's actually kind of something that the models, you know, we have like, the parameters are informed by these litter bag studies, and they show that, you know, once you're about like 5 centimeters under the marsh, you can have somewhere between like 30% and like 60% retention. But yeah, it's probably, it's kind of hard to tell exactly how much they're holding on to when you're just looking at the hindcast, because the model has like what are called identifiability issues, meaning it could kind of come to the same conclusion based on different combinations of parameters. So in the model runs that I do, below ground turnover and slow pool allocation are negatively correlated, meaning you can have the same answer from really high preservation but really low root turnover, or lower preservation and higher root turnover. I think, and so the model slims down the kind of possibilities of what amount gets preserved, but not as much as you'd hope. I think to really get at that answer, you would have to have more of a holistic site level carbon budget, knowing what's coming in and out of the vertical flux, what's coming in and out of the lateral flux, and all of those together, I think, could help you triangulate on a better picture on exactly the processes of how the marsh is holding on to carbon. I got a little nerdy, I got a little technical there, but that's my best answer.
Thanks.
Okay. Let's see. It's like. If there's any public comment, you can raise your hand. Give it like 5 seconds, 5 more seconds. Great, I think we can go on to the next item.
Thank you for answering all of our questions.
Thanks for asking such good questions.
I can only assume that the modeling team in the room will be in touch with you all. So
Yeah, thanks, Jim and Lydia.
Hand sanitizer on the line.
Okay.
Presenting for us.
Thank you.
Should I get going?
Yeah.
Oh, I wasn't sure we transitioned. Okay.
I'm pitch hitting right now. I'm like, I forget. Yeah, good. You're good. Yeah.
What, Carrie, put the
Okay. Well, those were really great presentations. I personally learned a lot. So in some cases I heard you say things like, well, for some of you, this might be a refresher. I'm like, yeah, that's definitely, that's for me. So thank you very much. Really, really great presentations and discussion. And I'm sorry I had to be in and out for some of that discussion. Let's see. Before I jump into the targets, I did just want to flag an update about our timing for the updated Natural Working Lands Climate Smart Strategy. And I just want to let everyone know that we have shifted our timing and we're not going to be releasing a draft until the fall, likely like sometime in September. And so I just wanted to put that out there for all of your awareness. And we can talk more about it at the July meeting if you want, but just wanted to make sure that we shared that with you all ASAP. All right, now I will do a short presentation on the nature-based solution climate targets that were released on Earth Day, and then really excited to have a discussion with all of you. And so I think my ask would be that we save questions, but if you've got a question that's like, yeah, I can't continue with this presentation until I get this answered, just interrupt me. But it won't be super long, no more than 10 minutes. Okay, next slide. So how did we approach sort of generally this target setting exercise? We wanted all of these targets to be quantitative, and to identify sort of what are the most effective nature-based solutions. And our North Star was those that build the health and resilience of our lands, which then in turn unlocks their ability to serve as durable carbon sinks. The targets are all based on best available science. We included a very thorough methodology document as an attachment, and I highly encourage everyone to please look at that. And, you know, I think there's going to be cases where, you know, you will have questions that we can answer, or you will have questions or suggestions that's like, oh yeah, that's a good point. Should have thought about it that way. So we're really keen to identify places where, you know, you all have recommendations for improvements or adjustments. And then we also really worked to make sure that these targets would, you know, not just deliver on our state adaptation strategy, but meet or exceed the carbon stock target that was set in our 2022 scoping plan. Next slide. How did we do sort of our calculation? Well, we considered things like how are our lands currently managed and what are the associated carbon implications? Again, what are the most effective nature-based solutions that can be scaled? What is technically feasible? What is practically feasible? And then our ability to measure and track progress over time. It's going to be a very important piece of the work moving forward. Next step, next slide, next step. Okay, this slide and the next slide show what the targets, and I think the next sort of set of slides, I'm assuming that most of you have looked at the targets that were released. So I'll zip through the next few slides, but just for those members of the public that are listening in, or anyone else who hasn't looked at this in great detail, I just want to flag the targets include, they're largely acreage based, but there are also targets that are you know, percentage based or like number of trees. So first of all, just want to say that these slides, this entire deck is really just focused on the acreage targets, mostly for expediency and to keep it moving, but the sort of full set of targets are obviously in the document that we released on Earth Day. So here's a slide, and then the next one too. They're sort of by 2045, what are the cumulative totals of action delivered by these targets for the acreage-based targets? So maybe we can go to the next slide now. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to look through these. We have a total of these sort of 10 cumulative targets by 2045. Okay, I'm going to now go through the acreage targets, many of them, by landscape type, and I'm going to go kind of quickly so that we have time for discussion. Okay, next slide. So I'll introduce all of the acreage targets with a slide like this. So forests are about 27% or 28.7 million acres across California. Next slide. And these are some examples of the acreage-based targets that we set. And as you can see, we included targets for 2030, 2038, and 2045, because those were the target years that were identified in AB 1757 for us to be working toward. Next slide. Shrublands and chaparral, about 32.9 million acres or 31% of the state. Next slide. Many of these targets, we really hope that you see yourselves in the sort of specific nature-based solutions that are identified underneath the broader categories of conservation or restoration. You know, we looked very carefully at the recommendations you all made and tried wherever we could to build language directly into these targets. Next slide. The next landscape is grasslands, and they cover about 9% of the state. Next slide. And then here are some of the targets for grasslands. And we are really excited about, the ambition for many of these targets and the specificity within each of those bullets underneath the conservation or restoration. I guess restoration really in this example is we're trying to be as specific and clear as possible. But what are we looking for? What practices are we talking about here? Next slide. So we have a set of wildfire risk reduction targets that actually cut across three landscapes, largely three landscapes, the three that I just walked through. So forest, shrubland, chaparral, and grasslands. Together, this is about 67% of the state. Next slide. And our wildfire risk reduction targets, I think the key sort of takeaway here is that across all three target years, the majority of the work is through beneficial fire. And by 2045, we're calling for 2.5 million acres per year of wildfire risk reduction work on the landscape. Next slide. So here we have croplands. They are also about 9% of the state. Next slide. And again, we've tried to be very clear about, the practices whereas for healthy soils, it's like, oh, there's so many of them. So we just referenced healthy soils here. We've also shown here at the bottom of the slide an example of a target that isn't acreage based, mostly because there was room on the slide. So this is a good example of a non-acreage based target, convert conventional to organic systems and annual and perennial croplands, 10% by 2030, 15% by 2038, 20% by 2045. Next slide. We have developed lands, so communities, roads, etc. These cover about 6% of the state. Next slide. And here are some examples of the targets for this landscape type. This was a diverse set of targets. And like I said, this is not the full suite, but it's a good sampling for everyone to get a sense of what we're calling for. Next slide. Wetlands and seagrasses are together about 2% of California. And next slide. Here are the acreage targets for this landscape type. And we made sure to be very clear that we are inclusive of like all of California's diverse wetland types. So delta, coastal, mountain meadow. You guys all know better. I'm going to stop talking, but all of them should be reflected here on this slide. Next slide. Sparsely vegetated lands. This is a landscape type that's about 10% of the state. Next slide. And again, we have a lot of ambition for this landscape in particular. I would say they're all ambitious, but this is a particularly significant one. I think if you guys have questions about sort of where these targets are versus where the state has been, or what was modeled for the scoping plan, or et cetera, feel free to ask those questions and we can try to come back with answers either today or at another time. Next slide. So I keep saying next step because that's kind of where my head is at. A really big area of focus is going to be how do we track our progress, track our action, and how do we measure our progress? So right now, we're going to be more regularly inventorying the carbon stocks on our lands using the Natural Working Lands carbon inventory that CARB has on hand. We're going to be sort of really thinking about how we can improve our understanding of the collective climate action that is taking place in the land sector. In other words, what is happening out there? And it was really exciting to hear about some of the work in the wetland space to monitor and track action. And then the third is we'll be utilizing CARB's forthcoming standard methods for tracking climate action across state agencies. And we will be reporting on our progress every 2 years as required by AB 1757. Next slide. So like I said, we really tried to build in as much as we could in terms of the recommendations you made into the targets document that we delivered. And we created a table that is in an appendix that we hope is helpful in kind of showcasing where we think there was alignment. And so I'll just kind of briefly summarize here that a lot of the targets sort of broadly align with, or even in some cases exceed, some of the expert advisory committee's recommendations. Those that are not included in that 47, so the remaining 34, basically they just didn't have the same date that the state was putting forward a target for. So it doesn't mean that we're not aligned. It just meant that there wasn't, we didn't want to make any kind of assumption about on timing. So we just left it. And then 7 targets that were recommended by the committee were just not in line with the scope that the state chose to focus on for the target. So for example, a funding target or a research target, a planning target or a carbon target, those are things that are outside of the scope from what the state decided to really focus on for the nature-based solution targets. I think there's one more slide here. Right. There was another kind of interesting area of difference, which was some of the recommendations from the committee really focused on avoided conversion. And we decided that we had issues with avoided conversion and felt that conservation was a better approach. And in some cases, you know, it was difficult to have the level of alignment between your recommendation and the targets based on how specific some of those recommendations were. So we were really trying to make sure that these targets were, as the slide says, aspatial and relatively broad. And so, you know, not necessarily able to like include that same level of specificity in the targets themselves. And then lastly, I think, you know, the EAC's references around alignment with 30 by 30. And in some cases, like, yes, our work absolutely does connect, but not 100%. And so we just wanted to also kind of flag that for the committee. We worked with almost 45 different state government entities, so departments, agencies, commissions, et cetera, to develop these targets. And we sent all of them your recommendations. And we did get some questions. We also, of course, within the team that you see right here, the CDFA, CARB, and CNRA team had questions as well. And so we decided to identify some of them in the lead up to the alignment table, just because we wanted to get the conversation started. And so I thought I could sort of, we'll include a slide here. And I think my goal isn't necessarily, I don't know how much time we have or what the interest is in, you know, starting a discussion on some of these questions today. It sounds like Lori is interested in also including some time on the July agenda. So happy to just sort of preview the questions today and get into a discussion at a later date, if that's preferred. So maybe next slide, I can show them here. Right. So these were some of the questions that we had of like, how, for example, how did the EAC calculate your recommended carbon target? How did the target for carbon removal align with the way that we approach calculating carbon neutrality, and just the fact that there's flux on lands? We had questions about the calculations for the baseline calculations for greenhouse gas emissions. calculations. There was some specific sort of sentences or references in some of the recommendations that raise questions of like, oh, well, where, you know, it would be good to know where that, like, what is a citation for that particular fact? And then lastly, curious about how the committee calculated the financial target. So I think with that, this presentation is done and we could break it into, I'll turn it back over to those in the room and we can get into a discussion.
Thank you, Amanda. That was very comprehensive for like a very data driven, and I appreciate the level of detail that you gave in terms of how things were decided and you know what correspondence there was between our recommendations and you know what came forward, and also just some insight into the process that you went through to incorporate our work. That's really helpful to understand. I know it was a huge lift based on what you explained to us in some of our other meetings, so thank you. So I want to recognize, I know Lori's not here. She also expressed to me that she wants to put an item on the agenda to have a more in-depth discussion about this report and this new scope of work that came forward. However, we do have, it is 4:08, and I think that I can read that. So we do have a little bit of time to talk because we do have this meeting until 5. So I want to get a read on the room. Would you like to either ask follow-up on some of the questions to get clarity on what Amanda just presented to us at the end, on some of those concerns? Do you want to ask general questions and just make a record of them so that we can have a more detailed discourse next time, so that we're all kind of coming into the room with some prepared questions? Or, you know, what do you want to do? Like, what are some thoughts here? You know, how do you want to use this time? And we also probably, I would imagine that some of the members of the public who are on the line right now might appreciate having time to ask some direct questions as well. So I see Christy just put her hand up. So and Matt. And Matt as well. Okay, and Laura. So Laura, so we've got 3 so far. Okay, let's go with Matt and then Christy and then Laura.
Thanks. Just real quick, of the agencies that were involved in the draft and the review, is the Office of Attorney General involved in any of that?
No.
Okay. And then shoot, I had a second follow-up question. I'm gonna blow it right now.
I'll be here. You can come back to it.
Great, awesome. We're not going anywhere.
Okay, Christy.
Great. I just wanted to comment on process. I thought I really appreciated the presentation. There's a lot of our EAC members that aren't here this month. So my suggestion was just to be what you were saying, Carrie, is for the committee, not the public, but for the committee. If somebody has a burning thing, but rather than have Amanda go through things twice, and a lot of the responses to those discussion questions, I think we want the whole committee. So that would be, I would say, let's do it in July, and the people who weren't here can view this, read the materials, read the appendix, and then we can be prepared to respond to Amanda's questions for us, but also any questions we have, so that we're not going through things twice because of all the people that aren't here. That's just my minor suggestion.
Thanks, Christy. I'm gonna not to cut Laura for a second, but I want to advance that to the group. Can we have an informal show of hands if people agree with that process on the panel, to wait until next time to gather our materials together and our questions? Okay. Okay, so all right, we have some consensus in the room, and Christy, so I think that puts us over the majority. So let's go ahead and do that. But I do want to allow Laura to ask to chime in or to ask your question.
Yeah, I mean, if we're gonna have questions and discussion next time, then I can hold. I was just gonna ask, I was interested to hear more about this avoided conversion versus conservation kind of.
Yeah.
discussion, but that might be, I think that touches on multiple different areas.
I think you're right.
And so within the targets, so it might be, and I saw in the report also that you define conservation more loosely than some people might. So I think there's probably a little bit
Okay.
more to that discussion to understand. Talk through, so we can meet.
So it sounds like if anyone would like to give Lori some feedback on what kind of input you might have or what kind of questions you might have next time, that could be really helpful. Also, that would help us design the agenda to figure out how much time we might need to allocate and how much time we might need to ask of Amanda, sorry, to be here and answer questions. So let's
I also asked, do you know what else is on the agenda? Because I had an exchange with Lori about forest related topics being on the agenda for next time, and I wasn't sure how firm that was. I was just I didn't realize she wasn't gonna be here. So I was gonna follow up with her in person, but I can also follow up with her separately.
I think that might be better because I'm not aware of what I know we have a host of other land use types that we, are still in front of us. And I think we only have 3 more meetings currently on our schedule for the year. So definitely.
Yeah, and I guess the reason I was wondering is if it was gonna be just because of the way like the modeling works, it makes sense for land use types.
Okay.
Or something, I don't know. So I'll reach out to her separately.
Okay, sounds good.
It might make sense. I do believe when we surveyed attendance, there are people who have to miss every meeting, so there might be people who aren't here today, will be here tomorrow, but vice versa, people here today won't be here in July, summer vacation. So I don't know if it's worth like reaching out to the subgroups you all worked with and coming up with some questions, and whoever's going to be here.
That's a great suggestion. I think. No, I
see.
Yes. Okay. Who spoke online?
Oh, Matt's got his hand up.
I'll be super brief. I remembered what I thunk. As for responding to the questions, a lot of this is always about clarification and, sharing language, but sometimes we disagree. And sometimes it's nice to have a tiebreaker, a third-party ritual, and I'm looking ahead to try to find a way to plan for constructive resolution of distance between staff and expert advisory groups that involves maybe even us fundraising to pay for third-party technical consultants that help build confidence in the entire process. We may agree on something. It'd be nice to have, I don't want to call it a conflict resolution strategy, but a synthesis strategy for how we bring together disparate opinions between staff and advisors. It's a whole lot better than maligning each other. I don't know how we can do that, but I'll help go find the money, Amanda, if people understand what I'm getting at, because there's nothing worse than a aborted process that undermines confidence.
Here's my initial reaction, which is, why don't we see how the conversation goes? And if we feel like that's something that should be explored, then we can look into that for sure. But I think maybe just having the initial conversation around we will have disagreements, and that's okay. Like, I don't think, we're not suggesting that there's perfect alignment. And every single person who we've talked to, we've said, please look at the methodology, because we want to know where we have areas of disagreement, either because we just straight up disagree or because we didn't understand something, and now that we do, got it, we can think about that for the future. So let's have that first conversation and see how it goes. Okay, cool.
Sounds good. I think that makes sense. And I think also that our committee has had a lot of decorum even throughout difficult conversations. So I think that we can do that. So, okay, so trying to think of what would Lori say right now. So I think I like to put out there that we bring this maybe we discuss the process briefly about, we're going to be in our small groups like we had for the last effort to pull together the recommendations. So we agree to gather informally in our small groups and then send, what is appropriate for us to send our comments to Lori, or should we send them to someone in your organization, Plessy? If we're going to be collating any sort of questions that we might have to bring to the agenda.
I would say bring them to Lori.
Okay. All right.
And is this if we won't be present, or is this
Just
do you
in
want
general,
all of
like
it?
just to
Yeah.
make sure we go through a little thought before we get to the meeting.
Do those need to be available ahead with the agenda? Or I'm just thinking about like travel
Yeah.
schedules, and
That's a good point.
so I'll be on vacation until the 9th, and then it'll be a little tight because I guess I'm just wondering, are we thinking that these are somehow formal feedback, or it's just discussion? So it seems like it's not necessary to necessarily like document.
That's a good point.
I agree, because we weren't, if we decided to do it today, we were just gonna ask Amanda questions right now. I mean, I am in no way an expert on all the rules of these meetings and what we can and can't do, but I don't mind being organized ahead of time. But if we had just decided right now, oh, wait, we got a bunch of questions that we're gonna ask, we wouldn't have had to send them 2 weeks ahead of time. So that's my thinking, but.
Okay. I concur with that, but I think that, well, at least for myself, I know I would benefit from a brief discussion with people who had written the section on the act.
And I,
Get our questions.
from our perspective too, if there are questions that you have and you're able to share those before the meeting, that will help us prepare responses and or make sure the right people are in the room to respond to those questions. I mean, certainly we're going to bring people no matter what, but having any kind of insight ahead of time of what some of the questions are is helpful for us. And then, on the process side, yeah, you can ask questions and we can have discussion, whenever we're in these public sessions. And if there are other kind of formal recommendations or feedback that you as a group want to provide, that's when it needs to get kind of voted on or decided on in the public meeting, right? Like, and, put it as part of the agenda. But just a discussion and questions, like that's fine to have it now or to give us feedback. And then we can come prepared next meeting to respond to those questions.
Yeah, especially if you have like technical or methodological questions, like, yeah, we have 81 actions. Every single one has a method and like, I don't have it all memorized. So, yeah, it would be good. A little heads up so I can actually provide some smart responses.
Right.
Yeah.
That sounds good. That would have to go through Lori, I think.
The questions.
The technical ones at least.
Okay.
Or if it's just, if it's not the exact wording, if it's, we're gonna ask, like, we have questions about this topic area, that'll also help us narrow down like who needs here.
Yeah. And
They
there were,
don't need to go on the agenda. It's just a way to distribute them in a seamless fashion to.
Yeah.
Right.
And of course you can ask questions, just off the cuff too, during the, discussion.
and there were other things too in the targets document around state agency actions to help support implementation of the targets too, to cross many different state agencies. So that's why I was saying, like, any preliminary input on like what the types of questions are, because we did have to kind of coordinate across a bunch of different other agencies on some stuff. So, Adam, yeah, unless we don't have everything, we might need to go talk to them and pull them in or something like that.
Okay, so Amanda says yes. Okay. So I know that we still have to do public comment. So should we take a break for that? Does everybody feel like that's good? If there's anything else you want to discuss related to the next meeting or anything from today?
I mean, I feel like I have to like do the obligatory, which is, the announcement of these targets, in my view, has been 15 years coming. And yeah, exactly right. Like I've been working on climate change work for a very long time, and when we passed AB 32 in 2006 and we did our first scoping plan and we adopted it by the board in 2008, we more or less kind of just came up with a forestry-based target out of nothing because we wanted to recognize the importance of the forest sector in helping to achieve our climate targets. And at that time, in like 2008, there was this discussion like, wow, we need to do a lot more work on lands to make sure that we can actually have some quantification around targets, have some actual targets, you know, understand the science better. Like there was all of this initial recognition about the importance, and it's, you know, been over a decade now, and we're at the point where we're able to actually have these quantified targets, and we can happy to have a discussion about what was right and what was wrong in those targets, but it's a big milestone in the development of our climate policy for a state, and we can improve them over time. And I couldn't be happier that we actually got past that milestone over the course of, you know, what really has been over a decade of working on this topic. So I'm really happy about that, and I really appreciate all of the work that you guys put in and the work that Amanda and her team put in to help, you know, cut across so many different state agencies, so many different stakeholders to at least get us to a place where we have these targets that are out there. We can talk about tracking, we can talk about all the modeling improvements, we can talk about mechanisms to get them to happen. We can, you know, we have a point to like work off of now instead of just, I don't know, we'll continue to assess it. So I'm super happy.
We appreciate that you brought us that perspective.
Yeah.
From as you were talking, it made me think of all of us in the room who work on research that actually most of our careers have probably been directed by the work that the state is starting and pushing forward, the synergy between what we end up working on and researching, either because of the funding or because we've been approached from there's a policy need or we need information on this. So the work that is happening in the state has been, at least for myself, like really impactful in terms of doing any project or any work. And I think that most of us in the room probably have a similar life experience. I wanted to work in South America and like work on plan development, but that didn't work out because climate change happened. You know, here we are working on a project we didn't choose or a topic we didn't choose for ourselves. But thank you.
Public comment?
Public comment.
Public comment, please raise your hand.
Sorry, thanks.
Not seeing anything. Okay. No public comment. The other thing I'll mention is when you take a look at the targets and take a look at the appendices in depth, we've also put together an FAQ. It's on our website, and it addresses some of these questions around conservation, 30 by 30, avoided conversion. That might be an interesting one to take a look at.
That's good. And I'd just like to take we have our meeting schedule, right? July 11th, September 12th, and November 6th. And I think that those we agreed on half days for those as well. So
afternoons
to allow people to get here. So what else to say?
Well, I'd like to say for future agenda items, so if we're going to talk about forests next time, you know, like you all were selected on the expert advisory committee for a reason, and we would like to hear from you and all of your expertise. And we have a lot of forest people, so I want to hear from Laura, Christy, you know, Mark, Lori, you know, everybody that has an opinion on forests. So it doesn't have to be, you know, invited speakers. We can hear from our own committee members as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I respond to that?
Yes. Yes.
Well, I was also realizing that you all are making adjustments to how you're doing things for this next iteration.
Yeah.
And I think it could be really nice to have an understanding of that.
I can tell you what I would like you to speak to, right?
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. So maybe we could circle up separately and I could learn more because I realize I just have sort of partial visibility into changing.
Right.
Cool. And it's hard to kind of make it interesting and useful because I feel like a presentation is best if it's useful, right?
Yeah. Well, and on that topic too, I mean, I think you can see like the team that we're starting to build out at CARB, you know, specifically focused on questions around, tracking actions over time and helping to improve the modeling for the next scoping plan and supporting CNRA on kind of policy development and mechanism development. And so like, I'm super happy that you guys are all here for, I think it's the first meeting for many of you, not for Chelsea. But making sure that we can learn from your expertise on the advisory committee, and the staff can, thanks Kyle for asking a lot of good questions, can take that back and start to, implement that in the work that they're going to do. So, yeah.
Other than, so I appreciate put that forward for the future agenda item. Lori would probably also ask if there's anything that you wanted to bring to the fore that we haven't addressed in our previous meetings, or that has come up during this meeting that we need to address next time during some of the future meetings. Like, we learned that the climate smart land strategy process is being pushed forward, but we can talk about that more during the next meeting. So that would be an agenda item to cover. Pardon? September 7th. Expectations around that engagement with that process would be helpful. We did cover it, I think, during our very first meeting, but we haven't since then. So it'd be good to hear where you all are at in that process, and then with how we best engage with that. It would be most effective in the same way that Adam just commented on, like, we want you to talk about certain topics and inform this process that's changing. So it would be really helpful to us so that we know that we're also being targeted in our input.
That would be great. Yeah, we can have those conversations for sure.
Okay,
I
thank you.
don't want to step on Adam's toes too much, but when I look at the timing, and I think procedurally the stuff that we have, we have to plan our kind of future contracts and work that we need to do in support of the next scoping plan in particular, since that's due in 2027 and it's not that far away, unfortunately. And so, the type of additional technical work that we should be thinking about contracting for in support of either modeling or tracking, those types of things. When I look at the schedule, like, and our timelines for having to develop those contracts and like start that whole process, it's not that far away. So I don't know when you want to have that conversation. I'm going to kind of defer to you on this, but in my mind, like, that would be helpful to get the input from the committee somewhat soon as we're thinking of our procurement proceeding.
I think actually they've been covering that pretty well. Like the presentations today had a lot of like data gaps, knowledge gaps, which that will help inform.
Okay. That's good.
Like Matt has a
quick question. Is there any chance we can see the interagency comments? I guess that's Amanda.
The interagency comments on what?
Well, you mentioned that you had taken in commentary on this from 48 state agencies for your 30, was it for 30 by 30? I kind of want to understand what the state thinks is possible, so that advice can be complementary and supportive. And so when one of the frustrating things to work with one agency is to not know what all the other agencies think. And it seems like a literacy bump that any expert committee would benefit from.
So another clarifying question, sorry. Are you talking about for the Climate Smart Land Strategy or for these targets that we just released?
No, I believe you mentioned that there were 45 agencies commented on the targets.
Yes, Well, I mean, no, we're not going to share like the sort of track change edits that went back and forth across all of us. But I can say that the targets that came out reflect consensus. So all of the state agencies are on board with what was delivered. The other thing I can say is that for almost every single one of those additional state agency actions that we included in as part of the targets, for almost every single one of those, there is a lot more detail behind those ideas. And so if you want to follow up with those, like if you're like, who do I talk to at this agency to follow up on one of those things, we can 100% connect you with the right person. So absolutely happy to make those connections. But yeah, Those targets are the consensus of all of the state agencies. So
Yeah,
everyone is on
I
board.
appreciate that. And I just would say that like, there's a way of making them foggy and generic, like the reasons why agencies are in consensus, like their priorities as they relate to this process. To know, I mean, there's just, DWR has a very different way of rolling than some other agencies. And as a history person, I have to say consensus is usually a scary time, but I know I'm sure it's not here.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Laura. I guess related to Matt's question there, though, you also said that there was some like questions or concerns or pushback on some of our recommendations potentially. And I don't know if the slide deck kind of summarized all the most important ones.
Yes.
Or if there are others that are more specific to particular land types that would be valuable for us as we move forward and think about the kinds of questions and feedback we might have in the discussion in July.
Yeah.
Like if there's, if that's a subset of a longer list, or if that's kind of what's there.
So I would give a different like configuration. I would say the list that we included reflects like what emerged really significantly. But I'm sure there was like landscape specific questions that maybe something we could do is sort of return to our notes and identify what those were. Because if they weren't, coming up multiple times, we did not necessarily include them as part of what we identified in that like little one pager. So why don't we commit to looking back, and then we can share with you anything else that we find that are more like one-offs, but not included on the list.
Yeah, I mean, I guess especially if they, resulted in a departure from the, the direction that we're going or something. It just might be useful for us to understand that. I don't want to create a ton of extra work. I just wasn't sure what was represented in what the slides are. Thanks.
So just so I understand, will we receive some high level input, or is it,
It sounds like the slides have some information already, and then Amanda said that they would review to make sure there isn't anything else that's landscape specific that would be valuable.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And those questions that were on the slide are located on the first or second page of the second appendix.
Okay.
So were in the appendix with the alignment.
The appendices on the website, because I was just pulling in one.
There's an appendix for that. Yeah. And I think those questions are in that. Yeah.
Great.
Any last public comment?
Any last public comment? Please raise your hand. Okay. It looks like there are, Amanda.
I just had one other thing to flag for the group, just in case it's of interest, which is some of you may know that Secretary Crowfoot hosts these like monthly-ish convenings. They're called Secretary Speaker Series, where he, profiles something new and significant or dives deep into an issue, that's sort of current focus. And when we released the targets, he held a Secretary Speaker Series alongside with Leanne Randolph, the chair of the California Resources Board, and Karen Ross, Secretary of California Food and Ag. And it blew all attendance numbers for any other speaker series out of the water. There were more than 1,000 people who registered to attend, and over 600 that actually did. So there was a lot of interest. So the fact that we're not hearing from public comment here, I just want to make sure everyone understands that there was a huge amount of interest in these targets. So I'll echo Matt's comments too. Just deep appreciation and excitement on our end.
Okay, sorry, just Zoom silent. Okay. Okay. All right, well, I think if I'm reading the room, it looks like in the Zoom that we are able to come to a close. No further comment. I really feel like something's missing because I didn't hear about nitrous oxide from Will today. but anyway,
We had a side discussion.
okay, thank goodness. All right, no, I'm kidding. I'm around. Okay, so anyway, but thank you for today. Great meeting. Thank you to the speakers if you are still here for presenting today. Really appreciated your detailed presentations. And shall we adjourn? I feel like we need to do like sun salutation and prayer pose. And, if you do Pilates or yoga, but anyway, so okay, thank you so much. And, have a safe drive home.
Yeah.
Yeah.